Chapter 9 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Matt Borden. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 1, Chapter 9, Touching the Causes of Certain Marvellous Results. What is the explanation of this startling marvel? Is it to be found solely in the greater humanity with which the Negroes of the United States have been treated, as compared with those of other slave countries? A little research will show us that there were other causes in operation to produce these strange effects, causes chiefly due to the fact that the slave trade to the United States was brief in its duration and unimportant in its operations, compared to the slave trade to the West Indies and South America. But wherever the operations of the slave trade are of great magnitude, the effect is to check the natural increase of the slave population on plantations. In the first place, it introduces an unnatural element into that population, which it is proper here to set forth. And to this element, a portion of the decrease in the Negro population of the countries to which these estimates extend is indisputably to be ascribed. The abnormality referred to is the uniform practice of dealers in selecting cargoes of Negroes on the African coast to purchase a considerably larger proportion of males than females. All the witnesses agree in the fact, though they differ as to the motive. Some testify that it was more difficult to procure saleable women than men, ascribing this to various causes, as to the prevalency of polygamy in Africa, to the fact that there were fewer female criminals than male criminals, also that as to the chief offense for which criminals were sold into slavery, namely adultery. Quote, "It was sometimes pardoned in the women, but never in the men." Footnote, Testimony of Mr. Miles Lord's Report, Part 1, Sheet O. Mr. Weaver, same page, says, quote, "Few women are sold for any other crime than adultery, and that is very often forgiven them." Other witnesses, however, affirm that there was no difficulty in procuring as many female slaves as males. Mr. Eldred, captain of a slaver from Rhode Island, testifies, quote, "Female slaves can be procured on the coast with more facility than male slaves." Footnote, Lord's Report, Part 1, Sheet N, 6. The true motive is probably given by a slave surgeon, Mr. Falconbridge, who deposes, quote, "On the coast of Africa, the captains of slave ships never wish to purchase more than 1/3 females. Planters in the West Indies, in many cases, prefer males, because they lose the labor of a female in the latter end of pregnancy and for a little time afterwards." Footnote, Ibid. Mr. Falconbridge made 5 voyages as surgeon. Most of the witnesses state the usual proportion between the two to be 3 males for 1 female. The Reverend Mr. Newton says, quote, "The number of male slaves purchased usually exceeded that of the females in the proportion of 4 to 3, and sometimes of 2 to 3. Footnote, Ibid. The exact average proportion appears to have been between these two rates. In the report of the Jamaica House of Assembly, already quoted from, in which this disparity in the numbers of the sexes is adduced as a chief cause of the decrease in their slave population, tables are given showing the exact proportion in the case of 49,135 Negroes imported by the chief Negro factors into Kingston from 1764 to 1788. Of these, 30,636 were male and 18,539 were female, the relative proportion being, as nearly as may be, 5 males to 3 females. Of each 1,000 Negroes imported then, there were, on the average, 625 men and 375 women. Each 1,000, therefore, was only equal, so far as power of reproduction was concerned, to a population of 375 men and 375 women. In other words, to a normally constituted population of 750. It follows that as to any given West Indian or other slave population kept up by constant supply through the slave trade, we must deduct 25%, or, in other words, take 3/4 only of its nominal amount, on which to estimate its power of natural increase. Footnote. The committee of the Jamaica House of Assembly, from whose report the above is extracted, fall into a remarkable error. They deduct from the whole number imported 2/5, quote, to bring the sexes to an equality." Close quote. That would be 40%, reducing each 1,000 to 600. But, as each 1,000 contained 375 women, it was evidently equal in power of reproduction to a population of 375 men and 375 women. In other words, to an ordinary population of 750. To this extent, then, the decrease of population in the West Indies and South America is not to be wholly ascribed to the more cruel treatment or more oppressive labor to which the slaves were subjected by the planters, but to the policy pursued by the African slave traders in selecting their human cargoes. That such a disturbance of the great natural law must have produced immoral results in an aggravated form cannot be doubted. As little doubtful is it that this immorality was carried to an excess which still further diminished the rate of natural increase. As, however, it must be supposed that the slave traders brought to the market precisely the assortment of cargo which they found the most saleable, the above abuse is chargeable indirectly to the planters themselves. Had they desired on their plantations an equal number of each sex, the slave dealer would doubtless have found means to supply it. Footnote. Quote, "Many of the largest and best sugar estates on the island of Cuba belong to the different ecclesiastical orders. Under the mask of discouraging a vicious intercourse of the sexes, some of them religiously resolved to purchase only male Negroes, a devout austerity which would appear to have originated in the idea that men can do more work than women. Deprived of connections resulting from one of the chief laws of nature, and driven to desperation, the unhappy Negroes, not unlike the first Romans, had been known to fly to the neighboring estates, seize on the women, and carry them off to the mountains." Close quote. The History of the Maroons by R.C. Dallas, London, 1803, Volume 2, page 60. The slave trade had another, still more sinister influence. It is beyond a doubt that wherever that trade prevailed, it tended directly to aggravate the condition and to shorten the lives of the plantation slaves. This happened because it increased the temptation to cruelty and overwork. An author who resided 20 years in Brazil and who has dealt tenderly with slavery confesses, quote, "Until 1850, when the slave trade was effectually put down, it was considered cheaper on the country plantations to use up a slave in 5 to 7 years and purchase another than to take care of him. This I had in the interior from native Brazilians, and my own observation has confirmed it. But, since the inhumane traffic with Africa has ceased, the price of slaves has been enhanced, and the selfish motive for taking greater care of them has been increased." Close quote. Footnote. Brazil and the Brazilians by Rev. D. P. Kidder, D.D., and the Rev. J. C. Fletcher, 1857. It is Mr. Fletcher who writes the above. Of the two influences to check population above indicated as flowing directly from the slave trade, the first, connected with the disparity in the numbers of the sexes, is totally insufficient to account for the unexampled decrease in the 15 millions of slaves sent to the Gulf and to South America. Suppose that entire population, when it left the shores of Africa, to have been in the proportion of 5 men to 3 women. Its power of natural increase would have equaled only that of a normally constituted population of 11,250,000. But had the slaves in question actually numbered but 11.25 millions, and had they increased in the same proportion as the 500,000 shipped for the United States had done, the census return of their descendants today would have been 98 millions, more than 3 times the population, white and black, of the United States. The immoral influence of the disparity in the relative numbers of the sexes already alluded to, and its tendency to check population, is here to be taken into account. But that disparity prevailed among imported Negroes only, and did not, of course, extend beyond the first generation. Unquestionable as the tendency of the influence in question was to diminish the rate of natural increase, we can receive it only as a partial element, not seriously affecting the general result. Thus, the marvelous variance in the fate of the 2 divisions of Negro immigrants is not explained, though the exact figures are somewhat varied, by the disproportion of the sexes in these immigrants. As to the second influence, growing out of the temptation gradually to work to death laborers who can be replaced any day by fresh purchases, it is hard to believe that it should have exerted over human cupidity so terrible a sway as to cause the reduction to 7.5 millions of men, a population which, had they been treated and had they thriven, but as well as the slaves of the United States, would have numbered today 98 millions of souls. Climate may have had something to do in working out the ultimate results, yet there is no evidence to show that the climate of the West Indies and of Brazil is less suited or more fatal to the Negro than that of our slave states. A more influential circumstance, especially in the West India Islands, was the habitual absenteeism of many of the proprietors. The slaves were left at the mercy of overseers, often uncultivated and mercenary, who had no interest in their preservation so long as those who died could be profitably replaced by what were called, quote, new Negroes, close quote. Many of these overseers were unmarried men, and writers on the condition of the colonies frequently allude to the fact that, when this was the case, the lack of female care and considerate forethought as regarded the slave mothers and children had a very considerable influence in diminishing the population. Upon the whole, however, it must be confessed that, while the general facts in this case are indisputable, the explanations we have so far suggested seem inadequate to account for the extraordinary results we have disclosed. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Matt Borden, plantdoc.org.
Part 1, Chapter 10 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Michelle Eaton. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 1, Chapter 10. Was there a failure and a success? But the lesson taught to mankind by this stupendous crime is far beyond the marvel of its results. 4 years ago that lesson was in part foreshadowed only, and could not have been fully read. Today it is written in terrible characters all over the history of our country. 4 years ago it might have been said with a certain plausibility that the experiment of human slavery had two phases, the phase of failure and the phase of success. With a certain plausibility only, it is true. There has been success in this country, so far as the mere physical increase of the slave population can attest the fact no further. But population has increased in the world, in spite of ceaseless wars, in spite of constant vice and misery. It increased in famine-stricken Ireland. It increased in England throughout the term of the feudal system, which made of the island one great military camp. It increased in France throughout the centuries of that old regime of which the insufferable iniquities were at last requited by popular vengeance and culminated in the first revolution. It is to be admitted, however, that an annual increase from natural causes alone of 2 3/4 to 3%, prevailing throughout a term of years in any population, as among the slaves of the United States from 1810 to 1830, indicates that they have not been subjected to the extremity of hardship which marks the fate of Negro slaves in other portions of this hemisphere. And as, even to the present day, the rate of natural increase among slaves in this country has been considerable, it may be fairly inferred that slavery in the United States, even in its latter and severer phase, has been, as a general rule, more merciful and lenient than in the West Indies and South America. It will probably be claimed, in addition, that it indicates a very considerable amount of physical comfort and well-being. But any such admission would convey a false impression in regard to the actual condition of the slave, especially in the cotton and sugar states. The investigations of the Government Commission, of which for a year past I have been a member, thoroughly convinced me that the statements made in our preliminary report as to the condition of the slave population of South Carolina apply substantially to that of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas and Arkansas, and with no very considerable modifications, to Louisiana, to Florida, to a few portions of North Carolina, and to the western half of Tennessee. I repeat here, as applicable to the states above named, that which, antecedent to more general examinations, we had predicated only of South Carolina. This is one of the states in which the system of Negro slavery seems to have reached its furthest development, with the least modification from contact with external civilization. There it appears to have run out nearer to its logical consequences than in any other we have visited. There it has been darkening in its shades of inhumanity and moral degradation from year to year, exhibiting more and more increased cruelty and more marked crushing out, in the case of the Negro race, of the humanising relations of civilised life, and a closer approach in practice to a monstrous maxim, the same which a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, perverting history, alleges to have been the sentiment of the civilised world when the United States Constitution was adopted, and in the spirit of which he assumes, in virtue of such perversion, that Constitution to have been framed, namely, that the Negro has no rights which the white man is bound to respect. The evidence before the Commission shows that, half a century ago, its phase was much milder than on the day when South Carolina ceded. It is the uniform testimony of all emancipated South Carolinian slaves above the age of 60 that their youth was spent under a state of things which, compared to that of the last 30 years, was merciful and considerate. As a general rule, these old men are more bright and intelligent than the younger field hands, in many of whom a stolid, sullen despondency attests the stupefying influence of slave driving under its more recent phase. The disintegration of the family relation is one of the most striking and most melancholy indications of this progress of barbarism. The slave was not permitted to own a family name. Instances occurred in which he was flogged for presuming to use one. He did not eat with his children or with their mother. There was no time for that. In portions of the state, at least, a family breakfast or dinner table was a thing so little known among these people that ever since their enfranchisement it has been very difficult to break them of the lifelong habit that each should clutch the dish containing his portion and skulk off into a corner, there to devour it in solitude. The entire day until after sunset was spent in the field, the night in huts of a single room, where all ages and both sexes herded promiscuously. Young girls of 15, some of an earlier age, became mothers, not only without marriage, but often without any pretence of fidelity, to which even a slave could give that name. The church, it is true, interposed her protest, but the master, save in exceptional cases, did not sustain it, tacitly sanctioning a state of morality under which ties of habitual affection could not assume a form dangerous or inconvenient to despotic rule. The men, indeed, frequently asked from their masters the privilege of appropriating to themselves those of the other sex. Sometimes it was granted, sometimes, when the arrangement was deemed unprofitable, it was refused. Some cases there were in which a slaveholder, prompted by his own sense of morality or religion, or urged thereto by a pious wife, suffered these connections of his slaves to have the sanction of religious ceremony. But it is evident that to connect even with such a quasi-marriage the idea of sacredness or religious duty was inconsistent with that legal policy of the slave states, which forbade to render indissoluble among slaves a relation which tomorrow it might be for the interest of their owner to break up. The maternal relation was often as little respected as the marital. On many plantations, where the system was most thoroughly carried out, pregnancy neither exempted from corporal punishment nor procured a diminution of the daily task, and it was a matter of occasional occurrence that the woman was overtaken by the pains of labour in the field, and the child born between the cotton rows. Humane masters, however, were wont to diminish the task as pregnancy advanced, and commonly gave 3, occasionally 4 weeks exemption from labour after childbirth. The mother was usually permitted to suckle her child during 3 months only, and the cases were rare in which relaxation from labour was allowed during that brief period. On the other hand, instances have occurred in which the more severe drove the negress into the field within 48 hours after she became a mother, there to toil until the day of the next birth. A noble exception among others to such a system of inhumanity, gratefully testified to by the negroes who enjoyed it, was to be found on the plantation of ex-Governor Aiken, one of the largest and most influential planters in the state. His habitual clemency, it is said, gave umbrage to many of his neighbour planters, as endangering their authority under a severer rule. Under such a slave system as this, where humanity is the exception, the iron enters deep into the soul. Popular songs are the expression of the inner life, and the Negro songs of South Carolina are, with scarcely an exception, plaintive, despondent, and religious. When there mingles a tone of mournful exultation, it has reference to the future glories of Zion, not to worldly hopes. If to the above details touching slave life in this state we add the fact that because of the unhealthy climate of the sea islands off the South Carolinian coast, chiefly due, it is said, to causes which may be removed, the least valuable and intelligent slaves were usually placed there. Further, that being much isolated in small communities, these slaves frequently had children, of whom the father and mother were near blood relatives, producing deterioration of the race. It can excite no surprise that the Negroes of South Carolina, as a class, are inferior to those from more northern states. An intelligent Negro from a northern county of North Carolina, who had there learned the blacksmith's trade, and had been hired to work on a railroad in South Carolina, stated to the commission that he never knew what slavery really was until he left his native state. While there, he was comparatively contented. Within a month after he reached South Carolina, he determined to risk his life in an attempt to escape. To judge whether a natural increase of population is necessarily connected with physical comforts, it behooves us to look to the interior slave life of the South, to the motives which encourage such increase, and to the conditions which attach to it. We find these well set forth by one who had the best opportunities to observe, having resided some 5 months on her husband's plantation in Georgia, and being in the habit of recording from day to day events as they occurred. It is doubtful whether there has been presented to the public in modern times a more authentic or more faithful chronicle of everyday life in the cotton states than is to be found in the journal from which our extract is taken. The writer had been conversing with a negress who had formerly been a favourite house servant, and thus proceeds. She named to me all her children, an immense tribe, and by the by, it has occurred to me that whereas the increase of this ill-fated race is frequently adduced as a proof of their good treatment and well-being, it really and truly is no such thing, and springs from quite other causes than the peace and plenty which a rapidly increasing population is supposed to indicate. Peace and plenty are certainly causes of human increase, and so is recklessness. Here it is more than recklessness, for there are certain indirect premiums held out to obey the early command of replenishing the earth, which do not fail to have their full effect. In the first place, none of the cares, those noble cares, that holy thoughtfulness which lifts the human above the brute parent, are ever incurred here, either by father or mother. The relation indeed resembles, so far as circumstances can possibly make it so, the short-lived connection between the animal and its young. But it is not only the absence of the conditions which God has affixed to the relation which tends to encourage the reckless increase of the race. They enjoy, by means of numerous children, certain positive advantages. In the first place, every woman who is pregnant, as soon as she chooses to make the fact known to the overseer, is relieved from a certain portion of her work in the field, which lightening of labour continues, of course, as long as she is so burdened. On the birth of a child, certain additions of clothing and an additional weekly ration are bestowed on the family, and those matters, small as they may seem, act as powerful inducements to creatures who have none of the restraining influences actuating them which belong to the parental relation among all other people, whether civilized or savage. Moreover, they have all of them a most distinct and perfect knowledge of their value to their owners as property. And a woman thinks, and not much amiss, that the more frequently she adds to the number of her master's livestock by bringing new slaves into the world, the more claim she will have upon his consideration and goodwill. This was perfectly evident to me from the meritorious air with which the women always made haste to inform me of the number of children they had borne, and the frequent occasions on which the older slaves would direct my attention to their children, exclaiming, "Look, missus, little niggers for you, and massa, plenty little niggers for you and little missus." We have an abundant evidence of the correctness of the view here taken. General Saxton, for example, deposes. Question. Were the women under the slave system taught chastity as a religious duty? Answer. No, sir. They were taught that they must have a child once a year. The prohibition against suckling their children longer than 3 months is part of the same system. The result is that the slave families are usually very numerous. We found in South Carolina, among the freedmen, several instances in which the mother had had 20 children and upwards in as many years. The result is disclosed beyond possible denial throughout Mrs. Kemble's graphic volume. Excessive childbearing coupled with ceaseless toil, an interval of 3 weeks only being allowed after childbirth, these are conclusively shown to have been the source of shocking diseases and terrible suffering to the female slaves. The argument to be deduced from the great natural increase of the slave population in the United States would be much stronger than it is, had the ratio of increase, as it was during the first 2 decades after the abolition of the slave trade, been kept up to the present day. But it has not been kept up. I have already had occasion, in the extract cited from the preliminary report of our Commission, to advert to the fact that the system of slavery among us has been increasing in severity and hardship from year to year, especially for 30 years past. A glance at the census shows that statistics confirm what we had deduced from personal observation. From 1830, the rate has been gradually diminishing. For, as the superintendent of the census remarks, the greater apparent increase among slaves from 1840 to 1850 is connected with the admission of Texas in 1845. In these 30 years, the ratio of natural increase has diminished over 10% in the decade, or 1% a year. At the same diminishing ratio, less than quarter of a century would have witnessed a state of things under which the slave population would have been annually decreasing. Whether it would have fallen still lower, until, as in Jamaica and other West Indian islands, the deaths had so far exceeded the births, that in less than half a century the population would have disappeared, must now ever remain, let us thank God, a matter of conjecture. The duration of slavery as a system in the United States has been but brief as compared with its prolonged existence in West Indian colonies. Here that system had not borne its deadliest fruits. Here, especially for 4 or 5 decades after the Revolutionary War, certain features of a patriarchal character tended to alleviate its harshness. But in all its various phases, that system which confers on one race the fatal privilege of idleness at expense of forced drudgery imposed upon another race differs rather in the degree than in the character of its results. Those results are, as a general rule, wherever slavery exists at all, essentially and degradingly evil. Evil to the victim of the injustice, evil as certainly to the inflictor of it, for there is no human crime that does not recoil on the criminal. Alike in the slave states of the Union, as in the colonies of the West Indies, and in every other land in which the system of slavery prevails, its victims may be said to live deprived, directly or indirectly, of every natural right. One of the most universal objects of human desire and of human endeavour is the acquisition of property. But the laws of slave states forbid that the slave shall ever acquire any. The holiest of human relations is marriage, but a slave cannot legally contract it. The dearest of human ties are those of family, but a slave may see them broken for ever, without redress, any hour of his life. Of all human privileges, the highest is the right of culture, of moral and mental improvement, of education. But to the slave the school is forbidden ground. Reading and writing are penal offences. The most prized of personal rights is the right of self-defence, but a slave has it not. He may not resist or resent a blow, even if it endanger limb or life. What remains to the enslaved race? Life to man, honour to woman, any security for either? Nominally, yes. Actually, save in exceptional circumstances, no. In the statute laws against murder or rape, the word white is not to be found. Persons of either colour appear to be equally protected. But among the same statutes, in every slave state of the Union, is incorporated a provision to the following or similar effect. A Negro, mulatto, Indian, or person of mixed blood, descended from Negro or Indian ancestors, to the 3rd generation inclusive, though one ancestor of each generation may have been a white person, whether bond or free, is incapable of being a witness in any case, civil or criminal, except for or against each other. As far as regards the 2 worst crimes against the person, the above provision is the exact equivalent of the following. Murder or rape by a white person, committed against a Negro, mulatto, Indian, or person of mixed blood, descended from Negro or Indian ancestors, to the 3rd generation inclusive, though one ancestor of each generation may have been a white person, shall go unpunished unless a white person shall have been present and shall testify to the commission of the crime. The apology for a law according to which a woman cannot testify against the violator of her person, or a son against the murderer of his father, is that in a community where Negro slavery prevails, such a provision is necessary for the safety of the white race. The same apology is adduced to justify the taking from the slave the right of property, of marriage, of family ties, of education, of self-defence. The apology may be valid. It may not be possible to force one race to hopeless labour, they and their children after them, from sunrise till sunset, day after day, year after year, till death, thus to toil unrequited, save by the coarsest food and clothing, in order that another race may exist in idleness. It may not be possible safely to carry on such a system without depriving the labouring race of every right, civil and social, and of every protection to life and property, for which man has been struggling through all the centuries of history. It may be one of the conditions of safety to the master race, thus usurping the labour of their fellows, that some of their own children should be as utterly disfranchised as the imported African. The phraseology of the section we have quoted is very suggestive. To the third generation inclusive, though one ancestor of each generation be white, are the words, "The white man makes the law, and his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, so that these share to the extent of 1/8 of the blood of the attained race, may, whether slave or free, be murdered with impunity, if the murder be not committed in the presence of someone without that 1/8 of taint. The white man makes the law and exposes the chastity of his own daughter, fairer of skin, it may be, than himself, to brutal outrage, without possibility of bringing the ruffian who commits that outrage to justice, unless the wretch, adding folly to infamy, selects his opportunity when one of his own race happens to be within hearing or sight. These may all be necessary conditions, without which, under the slave system, domestic tranquillity cannot be maintained. Let us assume that in this matter the slaveholder is in the right, and that while slavery exists, these are his conditions of safety. What then? In what sense, except a blasphemous one, can we pronounce that system to be successful, which cannot maintain itself except in violation of every principle of justice and virtue which God has implanted in the heart of man, except by the abrogation as to an entire race of men of those rights of property, of family, and of person, to assert and maintain which, in all ages of the world, good and brave men have willingly sacrificed life. But there are other conditions, not set forth in statute law, with which the existence of slavery is inseparably connected. Those, namely, which affect the masters of slaves. Of all forms of prayer, none is more strictly adapted to the nature and the wants of man than this. Lead us not into temptation. Men in the mass cannot be habitually tempted with impunity. It was said of one only that he was tempted like as we are, yet without sin. But of all human temptations, one of the strongest and most dangerous is that which attends the possession throughout life of arbitrary and irresponsible power. As a rule, it is always abused. A beneficent despotism is the rarest of exceptions. This is one of the great lessons of history, upon which is based the doctrine of popular rights and the theory of a republican government. Under no phase of society has the operation of the law, which connects sin with ceaseless temptation, been more apparent than in states where slavery prevails. One of our great statesmen, himself a sufferer under the evils he deprecates, has set forth in strong terms the practical results. There must doubtless, said Jefferson, be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people, produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this, and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped with its odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and his morals under such circumstances. It has been customary to illustrate the influence of slavery on the dominant race by adducing individual examples of barbarous cruelty exercised towards slaves by their masters. These might be multiplied indefinitely, but they are less conclusive of the effects inseparable from the system than the picture drawn by Jefferson, the exact truth of which everyone familiar with the interior of Southern society will admit. Slavery breeds imperiousness of manner, impatience of contradiction or delay, ungovernable passion, contempt of labour. While it produces a certain carelessness of wealth and easy profuseness in expenditure, it discourages hardy enterprise in useful fields. Habits of the regulated industry are seldom formed within the sphere of its influence, its tendency being to substitute for those indolent fashions of dependence and of luxurious self-indulgence. It weakens the supremacy of law with its sobering and chastening influence. It engenders in young men especially a spirit of reckless daring, a sort of careless courage that takes little account of human life, a love of violent excitement, sometimes running into military ardour, and ever liable to take the form of gambling, or intemperance, or that debasing licentiousness which must needs prevail wherever, in any class or race, female chastity is neither respected by custom nor protected by law. Hence a state of society in which, with manners often cultivated, with an impulsive generosity and free hospitality to equals in station, there mingles a certain essential barbarism, which not only shows itself habitually in the treatment of those occupying servile or inferior positions, but also breaks out towards others in bursts of temper so frequent and violent that the old regulator in ages when force was law, the wager of battle, in its modern form of duel, is openly sanctioned by public opinion as a necessary check to social insult of lawless outrage. These remarks apply in their full force to society as it existed at the time the Southern insurrection declared itself, in the states we have designated as those in which the slave system has been fully developed, the states which first rebelled, the states which will be the last to return to their allegiance. No reflecting and dispassionate observer who has sojourned into any of these states long enough to become familiar with their manners and morals and social condition will pronounce the view I have taken of the results of slavery to be intemperate or unfair. From one or other of these results, no man or woman born and bred in a slave community, no matter whether they learn to approve slavery or to hate it, can be reasonably expected wholly to escape. It is true as to the border states, where the tilled estates more frequently assume the aspect of farms than of plantations, where the owner and his sons sometimes work along with the slaves, and even where they do not actually work with them, yet personally superintend their labour, so as to recognise and take interest in them as individual human beings. It is true, and should here be stated, as to those states, that the phase of slavery there existing is sensibly modified, and is divested more by practice, however, than by relaxation of law, of some of its most odious features. On small estates especially, slaves in the border states often have by sufferance a certain amount of property, continue to live by sufferance as if legally married, and frequently trusted with important charges, are sent to market with cattle or produce, are consulted in regard to the management of the estate. Under such circumstances they are greatly improved by coming into daily contact with white persons, and instances occur in which they are treated by the family with as much consideration as if their skin exhibited no tinge of African blood. In these states, the chief aggravation of the system is the interstate slave trade, the forcible separation of families to fill up those melancholy gangs, assorted like droves of cattle, and whose destination is to that mysterious and undefined land, the terror of the border negro, known to him only as down south. But even under this comparatively moderated phase of slavery, the inherent injustice of the system exhibits itself in the character of the very indulgences which in other slave states are forbidden by law. In visiting the coloured population of Louisville, this presented itself in a marked manner to the notice of our commission. I found living there many slaves, who, as the usual phrase is, had hired their time. One case was of a slave woman, apparently 50 years of age, named Charlotte. She had been hiring herself for more than 15 years. She had 2 children, one 13, the other 17, both of whom worked in a tobacco factory. Their regular wages were $2 a week each. Sometimes they did extra work, earning more. She hired their time also. For herself and these 2 children, she paid her owner $5 a week, $1 a week for herself, and $2 a week for each of the children. She had brought up these children without any aid whatever from her master, feeding them, clothing them, and this she continued to do even now, when her master took their wages. She inhabited with them a single room in a tenement house, about 12 feet square, paying her own rent. She supported herself by washing. A large bed and an ironing table, which together filled up most of the room, were piled with clothes prepared for ironing when I entered. This woman made no complaint, and did not appear to regard her condition as one of unusual hardship. The only thing she seemed to have expected from her master was a little aid in sickness. In reply to a question as to what he did for her, she answered, "My master never gives me anything, not even a little medicine, no more than if I did not belong to him." As her appearance indicated feeble health, I made inquiry on that score, to which she replied that she was ailing, but that she managed to keep up enough to make her wages. She added, "I get along well enough and keep the hire paid up. You could not pay me to live at home if I could help myself." I asked her if she had to pay the hire for her boys in any event, and her reply was, "If the boys make more than $2 a week apiece, I get what is over. If they don't make that, I have to make it good to him. He has got to have it Saturday night, sure." Another case was marked by an additional feature. It was that of a slave woman, apparently about 35 years of age. Coming upon her without any notice of our visit, I found her in a room tidily kept and herself decently dressed. She had been hiring herself for 11 years at $72 a year. Her husband, she told me, of course he could not be legally such, was a slave, and was hired by his master as cook in one of the Louisville hotels for $300 a year. Out of this, his master, she said, gave him once or twice a year a $5 note, nothing else. There were in the room 2 bright, intelligent-looking children, one a boy about 10 years old, the other a girl 2 or 3 years younger. One might go at a venture into a dozen dwellings of persons of the middle class in fair circumstances, and not find their children cleaner in person, or more neatly and suitably clad, than were these 2 young slaves. I expressed to the mother my satisfaction at their appearance. Her face saddened, and she said, "The white people have 2 of my children, and that boy is about big enough to go." I inquired how this was, and she informed me that her master left her children with her till they were about 11 years old, and then took them home to work. Up to that age she fed and clothed them at her own expense. The last they had taken was a little girl, between 11 and 12 years old. 4 months ago the mother had gone to the plantation to visit her, not having seen her then for 10 months. She had saved a dress for the child and took it with her. I knew, she said, that she would need it, but I never expected to find her as bad as she was. I could not help crying when I saw her. She was not dressed as a human creature should be. I took off her rags and washed her. She was serving my young master, and he had whipped the child so that you could not lay your hand anywhere along her back where he had not cut the blood out of her. I did all I could for her and dressed her, but I could not stay. Here the poor creature's eyes filled with tears. I brought back the rags my child was covered in. I have them yet. I asked to see them. She went out, it seemed reluctantly, and brought a small bundle of filthy tatters, which she appeared ashamed that I should see. If I could only have kept the children, she said, I would not have cared for all the rest. I like so much to have them clean and nice. This woman made her living, as I ascertained, solely by washing and ironing. She, like the other, had paid her expenses of every kind, the doctor's bill inclusive. Truly the tender mercies of slavery are cruel. Under what other system would men, assuming to be gentlemen, commit towards poor hard-working women such flagrant injustice as this? In the first case, the woman Charlotte, in feeble health, advancing in years, with no means of living except labour in washing and ironing, pays to her master $260 a year for the privilege of supporting by such labour herself and her children. The man who received this human rental had literally furnished no equivalent. For more than 15 years the woman had not received from him even a little aid in sickness. The children, for whom he now demanded a yearly payment of $100 each, had cost him nothing. For 15 years the mother had fed and clothed them, cared for them in sickness and in health. She continued unrequited to feed and clothe them still. Who, if not that mother, was entitled to their wages now? Who, except one in whom slavery had blunted every perception alike of justice and delicacy, would consent to receive and to use money coming from such a source as that? In the second case, $372 annually had been paid for 11 years by the woman and him who she called her husband, the law of the state forbidding that she should be his lawful wife. $4,092 the master had received from them in that time, for which he had rendered nothing except some $10 a year in the form of a gratuity to the man. Was this $4,000 considered by the master enough to take from these two working people? The mother in this case, as in the former one, had brought up her children at her own expense, had fed them, and had clothed and kept them, as any respectable yeoman might have been glad to see his children clothed and kept. Were the father and mother, after the payment of this $4,000, after the care and cost of bringing up these children, suffered to enjoy the comfort of having them with them, and the aid which, as they grew up, they might be able to afford? No. While the children were a burden, that burden was thrown to the mother. She too, as in the other case, earning a living as washerwoman. As soon as they were of an age to be of service, they were removed to the plantation. And how treated there? The young girl was taken neatly and comfortably clad from her mother's care. One would have thought that the most common regard for decency, to say nothing of justice, would have suggested that the worse than orphan child should have been kept as the servant of a rich man, at least as reputably as the poor slave mother had kept her. Yet she was suffered to go about the house before her master's eyes in filthy rags. One would have supposed that the recollection of the $4,000 received from the hard-working parents might have risen up to save, if Christian feeling could not save, this poor child, deprived of natural protectors from brutal cruelty. Yet she was treated as no man with the least pretence to humanity would have treated a dumb beast. Let no one say that these were cases of unusual hardship. The parties themselves evidently did not consider them such. There was no tone of querulous complaint. The facts came out only in answer to my direct inquiries, and neither of the women seemed to consider herself especially to be pitied. Charlotte thought a little hard of it that her master did not send her medicine when she was sick. The hire of her children did not seem to have suggested itself to her as any injustice. Even the other said she would be willing to part with the children if she only knew they were well treated. Had she been suffered to retain them, her gratitude to her master for his generosity would, it was evident, have been unbounded. One could see that the $4,000 subtracted from her own and her husband's earnings never occurred to her except as a usual thing. Both women expressed the greatest satisfaction that they were allowed to hire themselves. It was sufficiently apparent that nothing short of compulsion would cause either of them to return to what they still called home. What sort of home could that be, compared to which the privilege of hard labour at the wash-tub, purchased by a weekly payment in money, coupled in one case with a similar payment for the children, and in the other with the loss of them, was regarded as a favour and a blessing? Let us not imagine that the masters in these two cases were sinners above all men that dwelt in Kentucky. They may have been indulgent in their own families, kind to their white neighbours, honourable in their business dealings, esteemed in society. The anomaly is presented of men whose characters in one phase entitle them to be called cultivated and civilised, yet in another, to wit, in their dealings with a proscribed race, exhibiting such utter disregard of the mild graces of Christianity, mercy, charity, long-suffering, kindness, and goodwill to men, that it is not too harsh to say they live in a state of semi-barbarism. Such results are chargeable far less to the individuals who have thus gone astray than to the system which has formed their character. But a system has lamentably failed that results in the arrest of human civilization and Christian progress, in injury to the national character, and in disregard under any circumstances of the natural and inalienable rights of man. Nor is the contempt engendered by this system towards those occupying subordinate social positions confined to the coloured man. Under slavery there grows up a class of white, as well as black, pariahs. A marked feature in Southern society is the temper and demeanour of the wealthy slaveholder towards an indigent portion of his own race, the poor whites, as they are called, of the South. Slavery is to them the source of unmingled evil. Labour owned, competing with labour hired, deprives them of the opportunity to earn an honest livelihood. Labour degraded before their eyes destroys within them all respect for industry, extinguishes all desire by honourable exertion to improve their condition. Doomed by habitual indolence to abject poverty, complacently ignorant, vilely proud, it is doubtful whether there exists in all civilised society a class of men more deplorably situated. And yet how fiercely they have been brought to fight for the slave masters who despise them, and for the system which consigns them to degradation. Such a system is fraught with mischief politically as well as morally. They who violate the rights of one race of men lose a portion of their reverence for the rights of all. It comes to this, that the peculiarities of character stamped more or less on every country in which slavery exists are in spirit and in practice adverse not to religion and civilization alone, but to democracy also. No people exposed to the influences which produce such peculiarities will ever be found imbued with a universal sense of justice, with a respect for industry, with a disposition to grant to labour its just position among mankind. Nor can any people subjected to influences so deleterious ever be expected to remain in perpetuity contented and happy under republican rule. In no sense, then, neither political, moral, or religious, can the experiment of slavery in those states be regarded in any other light than as an utter failure. End of Part 1, Chapter 10. Part 1, Chapter 11 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Michelle Eaton. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 1, Chapter 11. The Great Lesson. All this might have been said 4 years ago, in reply to an argument that might then have been adduced in support of the assertion that slavery, though it failed in the West Indies and South America, had succeeded in the United States. But how instructive, how invaluable the experience of these eventful 4 years. New views of the subject present themselves today. Aspects of the slavery question, hidden until now, come conspicuously into the light. History had previously recorded the social and economical evils of the system. Now she has presented to us its political consequences. And now, therefore, going back to our starting point on the African coast, and following up once more the two diverging branches of the great stream of slave immigration flowing west, the one branch bearing 500,000 captives to this northern continent, the other conveying 15 millions to islands and a continent farther south, we are able, by the light of recent experience, to present more fully and clearly than ever before the comparative results in either case. Increase or decrease, apparent success or undeniable failure, the ultimate results have been fatal alike. The 15 millions dispatched to the West Indian colonies and to South America never as a population took healthy root in the lands to which they were banished. They had no growth. From the first and ever after, century by century, they melted away under the influences of the system that degraded and destroyed them. Their fate and the lesson it conveyed were immediate and apparent. God stamped the policy which enslaved them at every stage of its progress with his reprobation. But as to the 500,000 that came among us, the mark of divine condemnation, apparently suspended for a time, came in a different form at last. For a time that 500,000 increased and multiplied and replenished the earth. For a time their masters were wealthy and prosperous, as men usually rate prosperity. For a time these masters increased in political power. They held sway in the Republic. They controlled the national legislature. They obtained a majority of the public offices. The end was delayed, and when it came at last, it was the direct result of the peculiarities of character impressed by slavery on its votaries. Imperious and insubordinate, they rebelled against lawful authority. Spurning wholesome control, they rejected the president, who was the choice of the majority. Despising a working people, they sought to sever connection with the North, a race of unblushing labourers, seduced by evil habit into the belief that man's noblest condition is to live by the exertions of others. They undertook to erect a separate political system, of which slavery was to be the cornerstone. Thus did slavery bring on a civil war between brethren of the same race and tongue and faith. A war widespread and embittered and desolating as wars have seldom been. Thus will slavery have caused the violent death, in the country which tolerated it, of 500,000 of free people. Thus will slavery leave behind it, in the country where it held its millions in bonds, a public debt little short, it may be, of that which loads down the industry of Great Britain. If God, in his mercy, shall in the end preserve us from the results, to which these deaths and losses are but as dust in the balance, if our punishment does not extend to dismemberment, anarchy, extinction as a great nation, if lookers on from European courts are not to moralise on the ignominious failure of the noblest experiment to reconcile democratic liberty and public order that was ever instituted by man, let us remember how narrowly we shall have escaped. Let us call to mind what days of gloom we have passed through. How often, as the contest proceeded, victory was hung even balanced in the scale. And what a little thing amid the thousand contingencies, which our short sight calls chance, might have turned the issue against us forever. In our case the great lesson was long delayed, but how terrible in its actual results, how awfully impressive in its possible consequences when it came upon us at last. The conclusion of the whole matter is this. Reviewing from its inception on this continent down to the present hour, the history of that offence against humanity by which one race, in order to escape labour, usurps by violence and appropriates to itself the labour of another, we find that the tendency of that usurpation is always to debase the usurpers, and usually to extinguish the labouring race, and that in the only notable exception to this last rule, the effects of this sin against justice and mercy culminated in the bloodiest civil war that ever arose among men, of the horrors and sufferings incident to which we cannot even now see the end. If a calm review of this terrible episode in modern history bring no conviction that the crime which we are now expiating in blood must be atoned for, as crime can only be by practical repentance, by thrusting out from among us the wrong of the age, argument will be unavailing. If, as all signs of the times appear to indicate, the nation has already attained to this conviction, then it behooves us to consider how we shall carry it into effect, whether and in what manner we can effect emancipation by legal and constitutional means. The consideration of these questions shall form the subject of the following chapters. End of Part 1, Chapter 11.
Part 2, Chapter 1 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Madison Rutherford. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 2, Emancipation. To deliver an oppressed people is a noble fruit of victory. Chapter 1. A mixed question of constitutional and international law. I propose to inquire whether the act or acts whereby the slaves heretofore held in insurrectionary states were declared free are, or are not, absolutely legal and irrevocable. Seldom, throughout all history, has there been presented to any nation for its decision a question of greater import than this. Its solution involves not alone the social destiny of 3 or 4 millions of human beings, but also the permanent peace and the national honor of one of the great powers of the world. It allies itself also, in an especial manner, to the progress of civilization. The events of the last 3 years have radically changed the legal aspect of this subject. Questions once purely constitutional have now become complicated with questions of international law. A member of the Commonwealth of Christendom, our Republic is bound by the acknowledged rules of that unwritten code, governing the society of civilized nations, of which the foundation and the sufficient authority is the common consent and usage of that society. We are as much bound by its rules as we are by the provisions of our federal Constitution. In proportion as civilization advanced, it became, says Sir James Mackintosh, almost as essential that Europe should have a precise and comprehensive code of the law of nations as that each country should have a system of municipal law. Engaged in war, we must conform to the law of nations, so far as that law regulates public rights and duties during war. We must take from it, for example, the extent of our rights as regards enemies' property and the limitations of these rights. In interpreting the International Code, however, it behooves us to bear in mind that, as its office is to foster civilization and peace, and to mitigate suffering and repress outrage and war, the sentiment of Christendom, taking practical form, has been gradually molding its rules from the more to the less severe. Thus, among the Romans, the rule that renders enemies' property liable to confiscation was so harshly enforced that it was made to apply to subjects of the enemy who, at the breaking out of war, happened, innocently, and by the accident of travel or temporary commerce, to be residing among them. But Grotius and Vattel argue that, as these foreigners entered the country under the sanction of public faith, the government which permitted this tacitly contracted that they should be protected while there and allowed a reasonable time to return, taking with them their movable effects. And this practice, from its evident justice, has now superseded the stricter enforcement of the rule. Beyond all doubt, as a nation holding itself second to no other in its desire to aid the cause of humanity and civilization, our practice in war ought to conform to the milder and more enlightened phase of sentiment sanctioned by modern publicists. But in so doing, it behooves us to see it that the scruples of moderation do not degenerate into weakness, defeating their own object, and protracting the term of a war which is a disgrace to the age if it not be regarded as God's agency for a great purpose. We are guilty of culpable negligence if we fail to employ all the means which are legally and properly within our reach to bring to a close, at the earliest practicable day, the struggle which now desolates and depopulates our land. There is no just war which has not for its object, on a rightful basis it is true, the speedy restoration of peace. In pursuing that object, as the legal phrase is, via facti, in other words, by the compulsory means of war, injury must be inflicted on the enemy. States, being in the nature of vast corporations, are not, indeed, liable to punishment, but acts resembling punishment, though in fact but measures of self-defense, become necessary if we resort to war at all. It is to be remembered, says an able modern commentator on international law, that, as the will of the subject is bound up in that of his government, it may well be that the consequences of the conduct of his rulers may be attended with injury both to the person and property of the subject, and that the enemy is justified in striking through them at the government from which he has received a wrong for which redress has been denied. The just limit, in this case, is set forth by Montesquieu. Nations, says he, owe to each other, in peace, the greatest amount of good, and in war, the least amount of evil, that is compatible with their true interests. Guided by these general considerations, I proceed to examine the question of emancipation, legally considered. In so doing, it may simplify the matter if I offer a few preliminary observations. End of Part 2, Chapter 1. Recording by Madison Rutherford. Part 2, Chapter 2, of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Madison Rutherford. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 2, Chapter 2, Constitutional Aspect of what is called Slave Property. There has been a radical diversity of views on the subject. Extreme opinions on either side have been confidently urged, one party alleging that the federal Constitution admitted and sanctioned property in human beings, another that its very preamble utterly excluded that idea, and that none of its provisions recognized or could recognize in any sense rights of property that are contrary alike to law and to morality. We cannot reach clear ideas of constitutionality of emancipation under any circumstances until we settle, in advance, under what phase and to what extent the social relation known as slavery is recognized, if it be recognized, by the Constitution of the United States. And throughout the prosecution of such an inquiry, it behooves us to bear in mind the great fundamental ideas of human liberty and natural rights to give legal force to which that instrument was originally framed. It behooves us, further, to keep in view a well-established legal principle, founded on justice and identified with civilization, laid down by the Supreme Court of the United States in these words: "Where rights are infringed, where fundamental principles are overthrown, where the general system of the law is departed from, a legislative intention must be expressed with irresistible clearness to induce a court of justice to suppose a design to effect such objects." The constitutional provision regarding the slave trade cautions in its phraseology was temporary only, ceasing to operate after the year 1808, and need not, therefore, be considered. There are but two other provisions that bear on this subject, familiar to all, for they have been the theme of 100 excited discussions. One contained in the 4th article and 2nd section of the Constitution, being in these words: "No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." The claims of service or labor here referred to may be for years or for life. Both are included in the above provision. In point of fact, there were existing, at the time that provision was adopted, as there still exist, both classes, the first class for a term of years, then consisting, in part, of claims against foreign adults who had bound themselves to service for a limited time to repay the expenses of their emigration, but chiefly, as now, of claims to the service or labor of what were called apprentices, usually white miners. The second, for life, were claims to the service or labor of men, women, and children of all ages, exclusively of African descent, who were called slaves. The first class of claims were found chiefly in northern states, the second chiefly in southern. There was a great disparity between the numbers of the two classes. While the claims to service or labor for years numbered but a few thousands, there were then held to service or labor for life 500,000 or 600,000 persons, and the number has since increased to about 4 millions. The constitutional provision is that persons from whom, under the laws of any one state, service or labor is due, shall not be exonerated from the performance of the same by the laws of any other state to which they may escape. The apprentice or the slave shall in that case, on demand of the proper claimant, be delivered up. Such a provision involves the recognition of certain rights of property, but of what kind? Is the ownership of one human being by another here involved? Is the apprentice or the slave recognized in this clause as an article of merchandise? State laws regulating apprenticeship in slavery may give to the master of the apprentice or of the slave the custody of the person and the right of corporal punishment in order to better ensure the performance of the labor due. These laws may declare that an apprentice or a slave who strikes his master shall suffer death. They may provide that the testimony of an apprentice or of a slave shall not be received in any court of justice as evidence against his master. They may make the claims to service or labor, whether for years or for life, transferable by ordinary sale. They may declare such claims to be, under certain circumstances, of the nature of real estate. They may enact that these claims shall be hereditary, both as regards the claimant and the person held to service, so that heirs shall inherit them, and also so that the children of apprentices or of slaves shall, in virtue of their birth, be apprentices or slaves. They may deny to the slave or to the apprentice, during the term of slavery or of apprenticeship, legal marriage, education, the ownership of property, real and personal. But state laws and state constitutions, whatever their varying provisions, cannot modify or affect, expressly or by implication, the Constitution of the United States. They have no power, direct or indirect, over it. It controls them. The Supreme Court has decided that the government of the Union, though limited in its power, is supreme within its sphere of action. And again, paraphrasing the Constitution itself, that the laws of the United States, when made in pursuance of the Constitution, form the supreme law of the land. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. Therefore, no state action can add to or take from the Constitution of the United States. Therefore, state laws and state constitutions, valid within their own municipal jurisdiction, are without force within the proper sphere of federal authority. They can neither determine the interpretation of the federal Constitution, nor serve as commentary or explanation of its intent. It is an authority superior to theirs, and is to be interpreted by the words, fairly and candidly construed, of its framers. These words deny to any state the right either to pass laws or regulations discharging from service or labor inhabitants of another state held to such service who may have escaped therefrom, or to refuse to the proper claimant of such service the surrender of the fugitive by whom it is due. They do this. They do nothing more. And this denial of the right on the part of any state of the Union to defeat certain claims to labor held by citizens of another is a protection afforded to all claims for labor alike, to that of the master seeking a white apprentice, and to that of the master seeking a Negro slave. There is an evident intention, so far as words can mark intention, to go no further. There is an evident intention to refrain from any expression that might be construed into an acknowledgement of slavery as a social institution. Nothing could be more notorious than the fact of its existence as such in many of the states then about to be united in one federal union. But the responsibility of that existence is studiously left to the states who permit it. It is adverted to as a fact, not sanctioned. If while it exists, it is protected in one of the incidents which belong alike to it and to apprenticeship, the reason is to be found in the necessity of the case. It is evidently with no other intent than to avert angry conflicts between state and state that an individual state is not permitted to release from involuntary labor any person who, by the municipal rule of another state, is subjected to such labor. This view of the case is fully borne out by the remarkable phraseology of the provision under consideration. The word slave, though then universally used to designate a Negro held to service or labor for life, is not employed. We know, from the debates in the convention which framed the Constitution, that this peculiarity was not accidental, nor can we overlook the inevitable inference thence to be deduced. This provision does not recognize slavery except as it recognizes apprenticeship. African slavery, according to the expressly selected words, and therefore according to the manifest intent of the framers of the Constitution, is here recognized as a claim to the service or labor of a Negro. Nothing more, nothing else. It avails not to allege, even if it were true, that in 1787, when these words were written, a Negro was commonly considered property. Chief Justice Taney, delivering the decision of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case, asserts that in the 13 colonies which form the Constitution, a Negro of the African race was regarded as an article of property. If the opinion expressed on this subject by a large majority of those who sat in deliberation in the various states on the adoption of the federal Constitution, as recorded by Eliot, is to be received, as it properly may be, in evidence to prove the probable opinions of their constituents on the subject, then has the Chief Justice's assertion no foundation in truth. But, true or not, it has no legitimate bearing on the argument. Let the facts as to popular opinions in revolutionary days be as they may, they are but the opinions of individual colonists, and these cannot be received as a basis of construction for the words, nor can they rebut the plain intent of a constitutional provision. It is not what individual colonists believed, but what the framers of the Constitution incorporated in that instrument that we have to deal with. They avoided the use of the word slave. They incorporated the words person held to service or labor. They admitted the existence, under state laws, of the claim to service or labor, none other, a claim regarded in its constitutional aspect in the nature of what the law calls a chastened action, or, in other words, a species of debt, a thing to which, though it cannot be strictly said to be in actual possession, one has a right. In common parlance we employ words in connection with slavery which imply much more than such a claim. We say slaveholder and slave owner. We speak of the institution of slavery, but we do not say apprentice holder or apprentice owner, nor do we speak of the institution of apprenticeship. The reason, whether valid or invalid, for such variance of phraseology in speaking of the two classes of claims is not to be found in any admission, express or implied, in the provision of the Constitution now under consideration. The framers of that instrument employed one and the same phrase to designate the master of the apprentice and the master of the slave. Both are termed the party to whom service or labor may be due. The employment of the popular phraseology referred to, indicating social disabilities and a subjection of one race to another, which originated in local legislation alone, has had a tendency to mislead public opinion as to the actual connection between slavery and the federal Constitution. The mass of our people had come to think, at last, not only that the claim to labor was recognized, and was protected in cases where the denial of that claim might have led to a dangerous conflict of authority between states, which was true, but also that the framers of the federal Constitution, straying off from the landmarks set up by the Declaration of Independence, had recognized as just, and had pledged the nation to defend against all comers, a social institution under which one human being became the cattle of another, which was false. If we were to regard the Constitution as endorsing slavery in all its changing phases, shaped by successive state laws and institutions as these phases have been, whither might not the doctrine have led us? Among the ancient Romans, the master had the power of life and death over his slave. Let us suppose that South Carolina had enacted, as she might have enacted, a statute granting to her slaveholders this terrible power. Is the federal Constitution, because of such statute, to be understood as recognizing the doctrine that murder is no crime if perpetrated on the person of a Negro held to labor? Instinctively, we reject an inference so monstrous that we must have lost all respect for the best men of the Revolutionary period before we could adopt it. The second and only other provision of the Constitution which refers to slaves, Article 1, Section 2, remains to be considered in these words: representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. To avoid mistakes, it was deemed necessary to include apprentices by express specification. Why this? Everyone would have felt it to be absurd if the words had been, the whole number of free persons, including farm laborers. But why absurd? Because persons engaged in free labor are, beyond question, free persons. Not so those bound to service. While so bound, apprentices may be considered not free. When the term of years and with it the bondage to service expires, they become free, or, as the common phrase is, their own masters. It was necessary and proper, therefore, to specify whether, in the enumeration of inhabitants, they were to be estimated as free persons or as persons not free. But would there be any fairness in construing this clause into an admission, by inference or otherwise, that an apprentice, while bound to service, is a slave? Clearly not. He is a person not free for the time, because another has a legal claim to his service or labor. The Constitution admits this. Nothing more. And so of slaves. Other persons they are called, in contradistinction to free persons. Therefore, persons not free, improperly so called, saying that, like the apprentice before his term expires, they are bound to service, and that, unlike him, they remain thus bound for life. But unless we admit that the apprentice, bound to service for a season, is a slave during that season, we cannot justly allege that, by this provision of the Constitution, the Negro, held to service or labor for life, is recognized as a slave. A mere technical view of a great political question is usually a contracted one, of little practical value and unbecoming a statesman. The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. Yet we must not mistake for technicality a careful interpretation, distinctly warranted by the terms employed of a public instrument. Every public instrument, by which the governed delegate powers to those who govern, should be strictly construed. We know very well that the men who framed the Constitution regarded a Negro held to service or labor, not, indeed, to speak of the majority of opinions, as a chattel, but as a slave. It would be absurd to argue that temporary claims to the number, let us suppose, of 30 or 40,000 may compare in importance with lifelong claims to the number of 4 millions. The first are of comparatively trifling moment, have never molded or greatly influenced society among us, and might drop out of our social system without serious disturbance. The latter constitute a system that has roots deep struck in the social structure of half our country, that involves vast industrial interests, that has gradually obtained influence so great and assumed proportions so gigantic as to become a political element, overshadowing and controlling. It cannot properly be dealt with except after the gravest deliberation and the most sedulous examination, in advance, of every step we propose to take. It cannot be eradicated without producing disturbances such as convulsionation. But it is none the less true that neither the number of slaves nor the magnitude of the interests involved can properly influence the judgment in determining the just construction of a clause in the Constitution, or properly set aside a fair deduction from the wording of that clause as to its true spirit and intent. It is none the less true that the framers of the Constitution, in studiously avoiding the employment of the word slave, undeniably abstained from admitting into the instrument anything which the use of that word might have implied. Therefore, the Constitution does not recognize the ownership of one human being in another. In it, we seek in vain any foundation for the doctrine declared by Chief Justice Taney, that persons held to service or labor for life are articles of property or merchandise. In one restricted sense, and only in one, is slavery recognized by the Constitution of the United States as a system under which one man, according to state laws, may have a legal claim to the labor of another. It follows that the question whether the federal government has the right, under any circumstances, to emancipate slaves is more simply and more distinctly stated when put in these words. Has the federal government the right, under any circumstances, to take and cancel claims to the service of labor of persons of African descent held under state laws in certain portions of the United States? If there are circumstances and conditions under which such claims can be legally taken and disposed of by the government, then, under these circumstances and conditions, emancipation is constitutional. If there are none such, it is unconstitutional. This opens up the next branch of our inquiry, and as we are at war with one portion of the slave states and at peace with another portion, the question subdivides itself accordingly. For the rules as to property of an enemy during war differ entirely from those which regard the property of peaceful citizens. Let us, then, first examine the question in its connection with the insurrectionary states. End of Part 2, Chapter 2. Recording by Madison Rutherford.
Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 1 of The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by Grace Buchanan. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 1. The Constitutionality of Emancipation in the Insurrectionary States. Has the federal government the right to take and cancel claims to service or labor held by inhabitants of the insurrectionary states? An antecedent question is, are these inhabitants, without distinction as to individual loyalty or disloyalty, and because of their residence within a given territory, enemies of the United States? Vattel has treated as fully and as humanely as any other writer on international law of the rules of that law so far as they apply to civil war. He says, when, in a republic, the nation is divided into two opposite factions and both sides take up arms, this is called a civil war. A civil war breaks the bands of society and government, or at least suspends their force and effect. It produces in the nation two distinct parties who consider each other as enemies. These parties stand in precisely the same predicament as two nations who engage in a contest and have recourse to arms. In accordance with these views, the Supreme Court has decided that, because of the present insurrection, there exists civil war. The opinion of the Court, delivered in March of last year, is as follows. When the regular course of justice is interrupted by revolt, rebellion, or insurrection, so that the courts of justice cannot be kept open, civil war exists, and hostilities may be prosecuted on the same footing as if those opposing the government were foreign enemies invading the land. When one nation is engaged in war against another, all the inhabitants of the latter, without regard to their opinions as to justice of the war, on the part of their own government, become enemies of the former. If Great Britain, siding with the South, were to declare war against us, John Bright, though he might retain the same friendly sentiments which he now entertains towards this country, would be, in law, the enemy of the United States. Vattel sets forth this principle in plain and explicit terms. When the sovereign or ruler of the state declares war against another sovereign, it is understood that the whole nation declares war against another nation. Hence, these two nations are enemies, and all the subjects of the one are enemies to all the subjects of the other. Strictly in accordance with the above, the Supreme Court has given its opinion in the case already referred to. After reciting that the territory, quote, held in hostility to the United States, end quote, has a, quote, defined boundary, end quote, which can be crossed only by force, the court adds, all persons residing within this territory whose property may be used to increase the revenues of the hostile power are, in this contest, liable to be treated as enemies. Whether property be liable to capture as enemy's property does not in any manner depend upon the personal allegiance of the owner. Footnote. This boundary, earlier defined by the respective acts of secession, was officially declared by the proclamation of the President, issued under date of July 1, 1862. This was done in accordance with a requisition contained in the second section of an Act of Congress, approved June 7, 1862. The list includes 11 states, reckoning Eastern Virginia as one. It does not include Western Virginia, nor Maryland, nor Delaware, nor Kentucky, nor Missouri. Nothing here said, therefore, applies to the constitutional rights of the inhabitants of any of these states. To a proper understanding of the legal points involved, it is indispensable to bear in mind which states are, in the eye of the law, insurrectionary and which are not. End footnote. According to this decision, property of every kind, held by residents of the insurrectionary states, no matter what their personal sentiments or political proclivities may be, is enemy's property. It becomes such in virtue of the domicile of the owner, and of the fact that it, quote, may be used to increase the revenues of the hostile power, end quote. It follows that so much of the law of nations as relates to the right of a belligerent to take or destroy the property of an enemy applies in this case to the property of every inhabitant of the insurrectionary states, without regard to his individual loyalty or disloyalty. What are the rules of international law which bear upon this matter? Grotius lays down the principle on the broadest ground. He says, moreover, by the law of nations, not only he who carries on war for just cause, but also any one engaged in regular war may, without limit or measure, take and appropriate what belongs to the enemy, so that both he and all who claim under him are to be defended in possession thereof. Vattel is quite as explicit. He says, we have a right to deprive our enemy of his possessions, of everything which may augment his strength and enable him to make war. This every one endeavors to accomplish in the manner most suitable to him. Whenever we have an opportunity, we seize on the enemy's property and convert it to our own use, and thus, besides diminishing the enemy's power, we augment our own, and obtain at least a partial indemnification or equivalent, either for what constitutes the subject of the war, or for the expenses and losses incurred in its prosecution. The Supreme Court, in the case already cited, endorses this well-known principle of international law. the right of one belligerent not only to coerce the other by direct force, but also to cripple his resources by the seizure or destruction of his property, is a necessary result of a state of war. These authorities settle the question as to the legality of one enemy taking or destroying the personal property of another. In a general way, however, a belligerent does not become the legal owner of any personal property belonging to his enemy, so long as it is still in that enemy's hands. To obtain a right to it, he must reduce it to possession. Quote, "Owner of all property taken from the enemy," end quote, says Grotius. Quote, "We seize on the enemy's property and convert it to our own use," end quote, says Vattel. The Supreme Court employs a similar phrase, authorizing, quote, "the seizure or destruction of enemy's property," end quote. Until we seize the horses on which the enemy has mounted his cavalry, or the muskets which he has placed in the hands of his soldiers, they are not ours. As to tangible property, such as horses and muskets, we must capture before we own. When we propose to take and cancel enemies' claims to service, in other words, to emancipate the slaves of our enemies, does the rule hold good? Must we obtain possession of the persons of these slaves before we can declare them to be free of their bondage? In this case, the question is not of seizing and destroying tangible property belonging to the enemy. Even if a slave were an article of merchandise, we do not propose to ourselves the possession and destruction of that article. If we did, it could not be ours to possess until we captured it, nor to destroy until the laws against murder were repealed. The property with which we propose to deal and of which we seek to deprive our enemies is property of a character very different to that of property in horses or muskets. It consists of a right or claim, the only right over a slave by a master which is recognized in the Constitution, the claim to that slave's service or labor. This is, strictly speaking, a species of property in the nature of a demand, to be satisfied in the future. It is a debt, of a peculiar nature, it is true, not payable in money, not recoverable by suit in court, enforced by physical means, but still essentially a debt. Service or labor is due. It is indeed an involuntary debt, not growing out of contract between debtor and creditor, but yet as binding as state laws can make it. As practically binding within the state which enacted these laws as the debt an artisan might contract if he gave, in payment of property brought, his promissory note for so many months' labor. It is a debt due by an inhabitant of the United States to an enemy of the United States. Footnote. The question is not mooted here whether, because of the existing Civil War, slaves held within the insurrectionary states are in law enemies or not. We have seen that the principle on which the inhabitants of the insurrectionary states, without reference to personal loyalty, are held to be enemies is, first, because of their domicile, and secondly, because their property may be used to increase the revenue of the hostile power. But slaves are persons acting under duress. They have no voluntary domicile and cannot legally hold any property, real or personal. In any event, though by international law the government may rightfully hold all the inhabitants of the insurrectionary states as enemies, it is not compelled to hold them as such. it may undoubtedly waive its right as to the whole or any part of them. The question is a new one that has never probably been decided by the courts. Its decision is immaterial to the present argument. A debt due to an enemy by an inhabitant of the United States, whether friend or enemy, may be lawfully confiscated. That is good law, and that suffices in the present case. End of footnote. Property of this description, being of an intangible character, cannot be physically seized or destroyed. It is evident, therefore, that the usual rule that the seizure by physical force of enemy's property must precede our ownership of the same can have no practical application in this case. But debts can be confiscated, and after being confiscated they can be canceled, so that the debtor shall be forever free of the same. Nor is there in the International Code any rule or law to the effect that, before such confiscation or canceling, the person of the debtor shall be seized, or that the debt cannot be confiscated or canceled while the debtor is in the enemy's country. If there be legal authority to confiscate, that suffices. Is there legal authority in this case? Has the government of the United States, at war with the holders of these claims, the right to confiscate them? Vattel, in defining what is to be considered as enemy's property liable to confiscation, says, "Among the things belonging to the enemy are likewise incorporeal things, all his rights, claims, and debts." The expression is of the most comprehensive character. Quote, "all his rights, claims, and debts," end quote, embracing beyond possible question the claims or debts we have now under consideration. We shall search in vain for any special recognition of the right to confiscate that peculiar species of claim, seeing that neither common law nor international law recognizes the existence of human slavery, or provides rules for its treatment during war. We can be governed, therefore, only by the general rule as to confiscation of claims or debts, but that is explicit and all sufficient. Chief Justice Marshall, in delivering the opinion of the Supreme Court in the case of Amity Brown versus the United States, said, "The right of the sovereign to confiscate debts being precisely the same with the right to confiscate other property found within the country, the operation of a declaration of war on debts and on other property found within this country must be the same." Justice Story, though dissenting from the opinion of the court in this case, concurs in the above principle. These are his words. "I take upon me to say that no jurist of reputation can be found who has denied the right of confiscation of enemies' debts. There are no exceptions to this rule which apply to the case we are considering. It is true that, by the modern and milder interpretation of the law of nations, there are certain relaxations as to the power of confiscating rights, claims, or debts of an enemy. For example, in the case of rights granted by a third party to whom it is not a matter of indifference in whose hands they are vested. Nor is it any longer the law, though it used to be, that sums of money due by neutral nations to our enemy can be confiscated as other property. Nor are the debts of alien enemies, contracted in the country during peace, to be deemed confiscate, solely in virtue of a declaration of war, but none of these exceptions, nor any others recognized by the law of nations have reference to the present case, in which the question regards debts due to the enemy by inhabitants of our own country. Such debts are, beyond all controversy, liable to confiscation. It is to be conceded that the precise case, as it here presents itself, may be regarded as sui generis. A parallel case cannot probably be found in all history. A case in which, during a civil war, a question touching the confiscation and canceling of certain claims or debts due by one portion of the inhabitants of an insurrectionary district to another portion of the same rises to the grandeur of a great measure involving not only the peace, but the national existence of the power which proposes to confiscate. This could only occur when, as in the present instance, these claims constitute the basis of a vast labor system, endangering domestic tranquility and imperiling the national unity and life. A case so unique might well be regarded as demanding the establishment of a precedent. The courts might well be called upon to decide it on the broad principle that whatever is essential to the preservation of the national life, the government may lawfully do, just as an individual may, without imputation of murder, take the life of an assailant when such killing is necessary to save his own life. But it is satisfactory to reach the conclusion that the right to adopt this great measure of national self-defense can be justified even on technical grounds as involving a confiscation never before exercised, perhaps, by a belligerent on so grand a scale, but in strict conformity to the law of nations in the premises. It is therefore, in every view of the subject, lawful to seize or confiscate and cancel that large class of enemies' debts known, in the language of the Constitution, as, quote, claims to service and labor, end quote. It is lawful by the proper authority to confiscate these not only when the debtor is within our own lines, but in whatever portion of our country he may happen to be. What is the proper authority in this case? By whom can these claims be legally canceled? Evidently, by the same authority which may legally seize and appropriate any other property of the enemy. Primarily, then, by the sovereign or law-making power of the government, and secondly, when the exigencies of war demand it, by the duly constituted military authority. But the chief military authority of the United States is vested by the Constitution in the President. Quote, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. End quote. The President, then, is a proper authority, not indeed as President, but as Commander-in-Chief. As such, he has legal power, by himself or through his subordinate officers, to take and to destroy or use personal property belonging to the enemy. As such, he is sole judge of the exigencies which render necessary such taking and such destruction or use. In the exercise of this discretion, he is not amenable under any provision of the Constitution. The Constitution, in making him Commander-in-Chief, neither designated nor restricted his powers as such, but it conferred upon him, by implication, all the powers appertaining by the usage and law of nations to that office. Strictly speaking, the only constitutional question which can be raised in this connection is as to whether the person so taking and destroying enemy's property was, at the time, legally commander-in-chief. He is responsible for the manner of exercising this power under the law of nations, and as the law of nations is to be construed in the interests of humanity and civilization, he is responsible in case his act should outrage these great Christian principles. Humanity forbids us to lay waste a country, to sack towns and villages, to burn or pillage dwellings, to destroy public edifices, not military. Humanity bids us respect the private property of non-combatant enemies, so far as this is compatible with the exigencies of war. If a commander-in-chief violate these rules, which civilization in its progress has dictated, it is an offense, not against the Constitution, but against international law. The legality of his acts may be called in question, not their constitutionality. What was the manner in which the President, as Commander-in-Chief, took and canceled the claims to involuntary labor owned by the inhabitants of the insurrectionary states? On the 25th of July, 1862, in pursuance of the 6th section of the Act of July 17, 1862, commonly called the Confiscation Act, the President issued a proclamation warning all insurgents to return to their allegiance within 60 days on pain of certain forfeitures and seizures. This warning proving ineffectual, the President, when the 60 days' notice had expired, issued a second proclamation, declaring that the slaves held within any state which, on the 1st of January then succeeding, should still be in rebellion against the United States, quote, shall be then thenceforth and forever free, end quote. On the 1st of January, 1863, quote, by virtue of the power in him vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, end quote, he declared certain states, namely Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, certain parishes in Louisiana, and certain counties in Virginia excepted, to be then in rebellion against the United States, and he further declared that all slaves in the said 10 states, with the exceptions aforesaid, quote, are and henceforward shall be free, end quote. In the last mentioned proclamation, the President recites that it is issued, quote, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, end quote. And further, that emancipation is declared, quote, as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, end quote. The number of claims to involuntary labor, which this proclamation declared to be canceled, was about 3 millions. The forfeiture under the war power of so great an amount of property, the canceling of so vast a number of claims, disturbing as it must the social and commercial elements throughout a large and populous country, requires for its justification an object commensurate in grandeur with the magnitude of the measure itself. What was that object? Quote, all that a man hath, we are told, will he give for his life, end quote. and this is as true of nations as of individuals. No higher or greater object can be proposed to any people than the maintenance of its national unity, which is its national life. At the time when the President, as Commander-in-Chief, issued his proclamation of emancipation, the life of the nation was imminently threatened. A civil war, of proportions more gigantic than any which history records, had been raging in our country for more than a year and a half. The contending parties had put into the field upwards of 1 million of combatants. We of the North had already expended or contracted to expend full 1,000 millions of dollars. The war had been carried on with varying success. Now the Federal arms triumphant, now the Confederate. Northern councils were divided, and there was a loud clamor for peace on terms the acceptance of which could but result in perpetual war. So far as foreign nations had declared themselves, either by official acts or by the expression of public opinion, it appeared to be rather in favor of the Southern insurgents than of the established government. The contest had till then assumed no higher character than that of one portion of a great nation striving to secede from the main body of the same, and establish a separate independence, and in an effort of that character, if no higher principle be involved, the sympathy of the world is usually with the weaker party. In such a conjecture, the best and wisest among us saw before them a protracted war, a doubtful issue. The bravest confessed to themselves that we had need of all our resources, even to the uttermost, in order to avert the breaking up of the great American Union into such petty, discordant sovereignties as are to be found in more southern portions of our hemisphere, into belligerent fragments with the standing and influence, perhaps, of Venezuela or Costa Rica, of Nicaragua or Ecuador. We had need of all our resources, even to the uttermost. Had we at that time employed them all? Had we not up to that time left in the hands of our enemies, with scarcely an effort to disturb it, one of the chief elements of their military strength? Nay, an element so overwhelmingly influential in its practical results that according to its management, against us or in our favor, might be the ultimate issue of the war? Defeat if we neglected it? Victory if we improved the opportunity? Let us look closely to this. By the census of 1860, the number of white males between the ages of 18 and 45 was in the loyal states about 4 millions, in the disloyal states about 1,300,000. Let us say about 3 to 1. The disparity seems great, but as a basis of military strength, the calculation is wholly fallacious. For the disloyal states contained, when the insurrection broke out, 3.5 millions of people who were not insurgents, who did not voluntarily assist in the rebellion, but who were compelled by force to render it most efficient aid. Out of the above 4 millions, the North had to provide soldiers, and with inconsiderable exceptions, not usually extending to field labor, laborers also. Not so in the South. Her 1,300,000 had more than their own number to aid them in military as well as agricultural labor. For, as among slaves both sexes are employed from an early age to a late period of life in the field, the number of laborers out of 3.5 millions of slaves may fairly be put at 2 millions. Let us estimate 300,000 of these as employed in domestic service and other occupations, followed by women among us, and we have 1,700,000 plantation hands, male and female, each one of whom counts against a northern laborer on farm or in workshop, or a northern soldier laboring on entrenchment or fortification, each one of whom, staying at home to labor, liberates a white man for active military duty in the field. To 1,300,000, add 1,700,000, and we have 3 millions as the total in the insurgent states of numerical force available in this war, that is, of soldiers to fight and laborers to support the nation while fighting. Then, supposing the Negroes, all loyal to their masters or at least remaining to labor for them, the comparative military strength, so far as it is indicated by population, was as 4 in the North to 3 in the South. If we take into account the fact that ours were the invading and attacking forces, while the insurgents had the advantage of acting upon their own territory near to their supplies, with short inside lines of communication, and on the defensive, it need not surprise us that, after the lapse of a year and 8 months of unintermitting war, the scale still remained in the balance, neither side yet hopelessly depressed. Under such a condition of national affairs, when there was question of claims held by the enemy, upon which rested his powers to supply his armies with the necessaries of life, it was incumbent upon us to go much further than to inquire whether the commander-in-chief had the right to take and declare forfeited these claims. The true and fit question is whether, without a flagrant violation of official duty, he had the right to refrain from taking them. "You have no oath," our present chief magistrate said, addressing in his inaugural the insurgents already in arms against lawful authority. Quote, "You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy this government, while I have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." End quote. Can we suppose a grosser violation of that solemn oath than would have been the failure to employ the appropriate means, sanctioned by the law of nations, gradually to withdraw from the enemy half his military strength? Has a president done his best to preserve the government, to protect the people, until he shall have done this? Charged with the lives of millions, with the putting down of a gigantic rebellion, and the restoring of tranquility to the land, what right had our commander-in-chief, in the hour of utmost need, to scorn a vast element of war strength placed within his reach and at his disposal? And if he had refused to avail himself of such an element, would he not have been righteously held responsible for the hopes he blighted and the lives he cast away? Footnote: in this argument, I have confined myself in terms to the proclamation of the President as authority sufficient to make emancipation in the insurrectionary states legal and irrevocable. The argument, however, is equally applicable to the acts of Congress on this subject, which acts have, besides, other grounds of validity, unnecessary here to recite. End footnote. Under such a state of things, it was eminently and imperatively the duty of the President, quote, as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing the rebellion, end quote, to declare free all the slaves held by the enemy in the insurrectionary states, not merely to emancipate those among them who might succeed in making their escape and coming within our military lines. The important and legitimate object was to present to those still held in duress a strong and proper motive, to sever all connection with the insurgents, to abstain from giving aid and comfort to the insurrection, and to seek refuge from the superior force which compelled them to give such aid and comfort, by fleeing to that portion of the country where lawful authority prevailed. Footnote: the chief provision by Congress is contained in the 9th section of the Act of July 17, 1862, commonly called the Confiscation Act, as follows: that all slaves of persons who shall hereafter be engaged in rebellion against the government of the United States, or who shall give aid or comfort thereto, escaping from such persons and taking refuge within the lines of the army, and all slaves captured from such persons, or deserted by them, and coming under the control of the government of the United States, and all slaves of such persons found or being within any place occupied by rebel forces, and afterwards occupied by forces of the United States, shall be deemed captives of war, and shall be forever free of their servitude, and not again held as slaves. By the decision of the Supreme Court already cited, all the inhabitants of the insurrectionary states are, in law, persons, quote, engaged in rebellion, end quote. Therefore, all refugee slaves from insurrectionary states are by this statute declared free. Further, as all the insurrectionary states have been, quote, occupied by rebel forces, end quote, and as we may reasonably conclude that if we prevail against the South, all these states not already, quote, occupied by forces of the United States, end quote, will hereafter be so occupied, it follows that, by the operation of this law, all the slaves in the insurrectionary states, even if no Emancipation Proclamation had ever been issued, would, before the end of the war, have probably been entitled to freedom. Strictly in the spirit of the above statute, and going only so far beyond it as to declare slaves in portions of the insurrectionary states not yet, quote, occupied by forces of the United States, end quote, to be free in advance of such occupation, was the President's action in the premises, end footnote. Another great principle is involved. Every publicist of repute has set forth, what common sense suggests, as among the most important of national rights and duties, the rule that a nation, especially a nation engaged in war, ought to protect itself not only against immediate, but against prospective dangers, deriving all rights attendant on conquest, quote, from justifiable self-defense, end quote. Vattel says, when the conqueror has subdued a hostile nation, he may, if prudence so require, render her incapable of doing mischief with the same ease in future. If the safety of the state lies at stake, our precaution and foresight cannot be extended too far. Must we delay to avert our ruin till it has become inevitable? An injury gives a right to provide for our future safety by depriving the unjust aggressor of the means of injuring us. If, then, any of our enemy's possessions have been the special agency by which he has been enabled to injure us, if such possessions will still afford him the means to, quote, do us mischief with the same ease in the future, end quote, if thereby, quote, the safety of the state lies at stake, end quote, is it not an imperative duty to extend our precaution and foresight into coming years? Are we not bound by every consideration of enlightened statesmanship to, quote, deprive our unjust aggressor of the means of injuring us, end quote, hereafter? The case has not yet been fully stated. Not only have these possessions in our enemy's hands been the very sinews of war, but they were the original cause of the insurrection itself. The insurgents themselves, who best know their own motives, tell us this. One of the most honest and intelligent among them, selected as their vice president, Alexander H. Stephens, speaking for them before a vast audience at Savannah a few days after his election, publicly said, Negro slavery was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. These possessions have caused one rebellion. Shall they remain in the hands of the insurgents to cause another? Can they remain in such hands without a certainty of that very result? In other words, can we reconstruct a republic half free and half slave, yet preserve, under the operation of these conflicting labor systems, permanent peace? Let us take a practical view of this. Alexander H. Stephens, adverting in the address already quoted from to slavery as having been regarded by the leading revolutionary statesmen to be, quote, wrong in principle socially, morally, and politically, end quote, says, quote, this stone which was rejected by the first builders is become the chief stone of the corner in our new edifice, end quote. And he adds, quote, slavery is the natural and moral, normal condition of the Negro. This our new government is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth, end quote. This is the creed, self-expounded by its advocates, which is professed by the Southern slaveholder. Concede its truth, and South Carolina's Declaration of Independence is a document stamped with forecast and entitled to commendation. Whoever drafted it ran out his premises to their logical results. The convention that adopted it saw their way before them and did not, like their weak sympathizers in the North, expect incompatibilities. Having set up their great philosophical truth, the cornerstone of their political system, they saw clearly that they must ensure it respect, that they must protect it from attack or condemnation, and they perceived that this could not be done if they maintained fellowship with the North. Quote, the non-slaveholding states, they declare, have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery, end quote. This from citizens of the same republic they cannot permit, nor, except by secession from the non-slave-holding states, can they prevent it. Quote, all hope of remedy, thus their declaration concludes, all hope of remedy is rendered vain by the fact that public opinion at the North has invested a great political error with the sanctions of a more erroneous religious belief, end quote. Wise in their generation were South Carolina and the states that followed her lead, building their system of government upon a, quote, great philosophical and moral truth, end quote, which, unfortunately, they will say, the rest of the civilized world still regards as a flagrant moral falsehood. They can maintain the stability of their political edifice only by debarring all questions, all discussions that might assault and endanger its foundations. As in despotic monarchies, it was found necessary to declare it to be treason, punishable as a capital offense, to question the right divine of kings. So in a slave empire, they see it to be indispensable to forbid, on pain of death, all opinions touching the sinfulness or inconsistency with religion of slavery. 25 years ago, they declared from their places in Congress that in spite of the federal government, every abolitionist they caught should die a felon's death. It was no idle menace, as numerous murders for opinion's sake committed in the South before the war terribly attest. Footnote, quote, let an abolitionist come within the borders of South Carolina. If we catch him, we will try him, and notwithstanding all the interference of all the governments on earth, including the federal government, we will hang him. End quote. Senator Preston, in debate in United States Senate, January 1838. Quote, if chance throw an abolitionist in our way, he may expect a felon's death. End quote. Senator Hammond of South Carolina, in United States Senate, 1836. End footnote. Let us not blame the men, except it be for seeking to uphold the monstrous system handed down to them by their forefathers. They must resist the federal authority to maintain that system. They must violate the constitutional provision which forbids to abridge, quote, the liberty of speech or of the press, end quote. Self-defense and its necessities compel them. They found this necessary before the war in order to save slavery from destruction. The necessity will be increased beyond measure if slavery remain after its close. Now that the President's proclamation of emancipation has stirred up in every Southern plantation the latent longing for freedom, the dangers to their slave system from propagandism will be increased 100-fold. It follows that in this republic, if reconstructed half slave, half free, no man known to be opposed in principle to slavery will be able to cross Mason and Dixon's line without imminent risk of life. South of that line, the constitutional provision touching the liberty of speech and of the press will remain inoperative. A felon's death will await every resident or traveler in the South who prints or who utters, in public or in private, any denial that slavery is just and moral, any assertion that religion does not sanction it, The Constitution guarantees the right thus to print, thus to speak. The federal government is bound to maintain that constitutional right, but it cannot maintain it in a republic half slave, half free. What then? Slavery and the Constitution inviolate cannot coexist. We must give up the one or the other. Footnote. Events have occurred among us here in the North, which, if it be painful, it also be useful to recall, seeing that they serve as beacons to mark the dangers of the path we have been pursuing and the incompatibility of slavery and free speech. Such an one was the burning, by a mob, 28 years ago, in a free state, of a public building devoted to free discussion. Pennsylvania Hall, a handsome public edifice situated in 6th Street near Cherry, Philadelphia, costing upwards of $40,000, was opened before a respectable audience of 3,000 persons, of whom the majority were ladies, on the 14th of May, 1838, the managers announcing that it was dedicated to, quote, free discussion of the principles of liberty and equality of civil rights, end quote. It continued open 4 days only, to crowded audiences throughout, the subjects discussed being slavery, the rights of the Indian, temperance, and requited labor. On the evening of the 4th day, the building was destroyed. I take the account of this act of vandalism from an official source, the report of the Committee on Police, read in Council's July 6, 1838. On the evening of the 3rd day, May 16, while Angelina Grimke Weld was speaking, the, quote, house was assaulted by a ruthless mob who broke the windows, alarmed the women, and disturbed the meeting by yelling, stamping, and throwing brickbats and other missiles through the windows, end quote. No persons were arrested. Quote, as an attempt to carry away the prisoners might lead to a successful rescue, end quote. May 17th, the managers called upon the mayor, John Swift, to, quote, protect them and their property in the exercise of their constitutional right, peaceably to assemble and discuss any subject of general interest, end quote. The mayor said, quote, he could give them no assurance, if they persisted in their evening meetings, that the police was able to afford them adequate protection, end quote. But, quote, he would do all in his power, end quote. In the evening before the meeting, he went up to the building, found a crowd, and a man haranguing them against the abolitionists, entered the hall, and advised the managers not to hold their meeting. To this they assented, and the keys of the building were given up to the police. The mayor returned home. Later in the evening, news was brought to him that an attack had commenced on the hall. He collected a body of police and marched to the spot, quote, where the work of destruction was in rapid progress, end quote. He exclaimed to the crowd, is there nobody here to support the law, end quote? But the only response was an assault on the police. 2 or 3 resolute men who entered the building to protect it were seized and ejected. The furniture was piled up and set on fire, and the crowd, quote, directed the fire engines not to play upon the hall, or else their engines and hose would be destroyed, end quote. The building, with all it contained, was burned to the ground. The feature in this case which indicates most strongly the dangerous influence of a perverted public opinion is the feeble and apologetic tone in which the report from which I have been quoting condemns the act. It speaks of Philadelphia as, quote, having been selected as the rallying point of men known among us only as restless agitators, end quote, and winds up thus, quote, however excusable the excitement might be, it can never be tolerated without jeoparding our dearest rights, end quote. All the details of the proceedings within the hall during its brief existence, showing that the speakers proposed reform through constitutional means only, by the ballot box and petition, together with a full account of its destruction, will be found in a small volume entitled The History of Pennsylvania Hall, 1838. End footnote. But if we abandon the inviolability of the Constitution, if we attempt to perpetuate a state of things under which one of the most important provisions of the organic law, which binds us together as a nation, is habitually and openly outraged, if we surrender one of those sacred privileges to maintain which freemen first settled America, a privilege the possession of which, more than of any one human right, distinguishes the citizen of a constitutional government from the subject of a despotism, a privilege which, beyond all others, is indispensable to human progress itself, if we basely consent to such humiliation, can our republic maintain either the respect of the world without or domestic tranquility within? Certainly not. The North, now that her spirit is up, would not endure it for a moment. It would inevitably result in war. End of Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 1. Recording by Grace Buchanan. Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 2 of The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by Grace Buchanan. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 2. The Constitutionality of Emancipation in the Insurrectionary States. Let us pass to another matter. In South Carolina's Declaration of Causes for Secession, one of the chief, set forth as justifying and necessitating separation, is, quote, the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery, end quote. This, it is declared, the slaveholding states cannot permit, because whenever it shall occur, quote, the federal government will have become their enemy, end quote. To satisfy a slave-holding South so that she shall permit us again to unite with her, it is evident that we must do one of two things. Either consent so to amend the Constitution that no man shall be eligible as president, quote, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery, end quote, or else make up our minds to a second insurrection the first time a president with such opinions happens to be elected. The constitutional amendment, our first alternative, would be an infamy, if it were a possibility. The second alternative is renewed war. But the very head and front of our former offending against the South remains yet untouched. The loose manner, to wit, in which she alleges that the fugitive slave law has heretofore been enforced. This our offense was so grievous in the eyes of South Carolina that she put it forth in her declaration as the first, and in itself the all-sufficient cause for separation, adding, quote, "Thus the constitutional compact has been deliberately broken, and South Carolina is released from her obligation," end quote. What chance, even the remotest, is there that with slavery and freedom in political partnership, this rock of offense will be avoided hereafter? Let us for a moment imagine that the Emancipation Proclamation had no force in law. Nevertheless, it has been promulgated. Its glad tidings have penetrated to the remotest haunts of Southern slavery. To the slave, it is a reality. In his heart it has called up the assurance, the fervent hope at least, that if he can but once elude the vigilance of his master, there is yet freedom for him on this side of the grave. That hope, once awakened throughout the length and breadth of the insurrectionary states, can it ever again be put to rest? Is it not certain that under its promptings, no matter how firmly we may reestablish slavery by law, these bondmen would cross the border by thousands, for hundreds that have sought refuge among us till now, and when they do pass into that land, whose president proclaimed them free men, and where 20 abolitionists are to be found now for every one who was there on the day Fort Sumter fell, will there be increased cheerfulness, greater willingness to aid in their rendition than there was before the war began? What a mockery is the question! On what a foundation of quicksand do they build, who found their hopes of future peace on the expectation that a fugitive slave law will be more stringently enforced in the future than in the past, on the vain dream that Northern spirit, whether flushed with victory or maddened by defeat, will find no occupation more noble than to pursue and secure poor fugitives deluded by a national promise basely broken, and who had been urged to flight by belief in our humanity and confidence in our truth. In such a state of feeling, under such a state of things, can we doubt the inevitable results? Shall we escape border raids after fleeing fugitives? No sane man will expect it. Are we to suffer these? We are disgraced. Are we to repel them? It is a renewal of hostilities. Turn which way we will, slavery is war. There is, in the very nature of things there can be, no security for peace or loyalty from a slave state. The only practicable road to domestic tranquility open to us now is through emancipation. But in deciding a matter of such vast gravity as this, it behooves us to look to our relations with foreign nations as well as to those between our own states. That slavery is an element of weakness in war was denied 3 years ago by those Northern men who were in the habit of regarding it as a sacred thing, which to touch, even in the enemy's hands, was profane. No statesman will deny it now. The rebellion will be put down. Through the clouds of war we see already the beginning of the end. But if the 3 millions of slaves gradually coming over to us and swelling the ranks of our liberating armies had been 3 millions of free men loyal to the South, if the population of the Southern states, without regard to color, had been a unit in this struggle, should we have defeated them in their effort for recognition? If history speak truth, we should not. Never since the world began did 9 millions of people band together, resolutely inspired by the one idea of achieving their independence, yet fail to obtain it. It is not a century since 1/3 of the number successfully defied Great Britain. The present is teaching, and the future will teach more clearly yet, that slavery is an element of military weakness. We have taught that lesson to Europe. In case of foreign war, with slavery still existing among us, will she fail to remember and to apply it? In such a case, will England, will France, will any European power, save perhaps lagging Spain, respect an institution which they all regard as a national crime, a crime for which many of them have atoned by repentance and at heavy cost? In the case of foreign hostilities, would not Lord Dunmore's proclamation be reproduced in a far more dangerous form with a far more fatal effect? It is certain that it would. Footnote: in this well-known document, after declaring against all persons who failed to resort to His Majesty's standard, quote, forfeiture of life and confiscation of lands, end quote, Lord Dunmore proceeds, quote, and I do hereby further declare all indented servants, negroes or others, appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. End quote. The proclamation was dated November 7, 1775. End footnote. But this is the least of our dangers in such a contingency. In case of a foreign war, with master and slave still constituting a portion of our population, with whom will the masters side? With us, the detested Yankees? Or with those European potentates, all but publicly invited already to forgive the undutiful doings of 1776, and to send a royal scion to reign over them? Like causes continued produce like results. If we subdue the slave masters, leaving them slave masters still, can we expect that they will abstain from plotting foreign war that they may gain by it? And if they succeed in the treasonable plot, can we suppose that they will refrain from seeking their own advantage by an alliance with the enemy? If we expose ourselves to these dangers, patent to common sense, we shall deserve our fate. To foreign as well as to domestic tranquility, the only practicable path is through general emancipation. In other words, as we would hasten, by every lawful and proper means, the advent of peace, as we would obtain before this contest closes a guarantee against its renewal, as we would protect ourselves by prudent foresight and precaution against foreign complications involving dismemberment of the nation? And what duties during war more imperative than these? We must take and cancel our enemies' claims to service and labor. That service feeds our enemy. That labor supplies his commissariat. Deprived of it, his power to injure us is taken from him. Possessed of it, he remains our enemy, dangerous in peace, still more dangerous in war, while grass grows and water runs. Is not the grandeur of the object, then, commensurate with the magnitude of the remedy? If that remedy produced temporary disturbance of social and political elements throughout half our country, is not the alternative the dismemberment of that country itself, its loss of unity, its loss of peace, its final decline and fall as one of the great powers of the world? So far, the argument has been one of policy alone. Selfish in one sense it may be called, since it takes into account the interests of one only out of the two races which inhabit our country. An argument, too, sound and unanswerable if it be, which does not reach the full dignity of the subject, since it has not treated it in its relation to the progress of civilization and humanity, and to the national honor ever intimately connected with the national life. Opinions adverse to the lawfulness of slavery have for a century past been spreading and swelling into action throughout the civilized world. They have taken practical form and shape. They have become law, till not a nation in Europe, Christian or Mohammedan, Spain alone being excepted, stands out against them. England led the way. In 1834 she emancipated all her slaves. King Oscar of Sweden followed her example in 1846. Then came Denmark in 1847, France in 1848, Portugal in 1856, the vast Empire of Russia in 1862, finally, with nearly 30 years' experience in English colonies and 15 years' experience in those of France before her eyes, plain, practical, unimaginative Holland, by a vote in her chambers of 45-7, gave freedom with compensation to her 45,000 slaves, liberating them on the 1st of July last. The opinions which gave rise to these national acts are gradually finding place among the maxims of international law as expounded by modern commentators. Phillimore, a reputable authority, says, "There is a kind of property which it is equally unlawful for states as for individuals to possess, property in man. A being endowed with will, intellect, passion, and conscience cannot be acquired and alienated, bought and sold by his fellow human beings, like an inanimate or unreflecting and irresponsible thing. The Christian world has slowly but irrevocably arrived at the attainment of this great truth. The black man is no more capable of being a chattel than the white man. The Negro and the European have equal rights. Neither are among the res positive in commercio, in which it is lawful for states or individuals to traffic." The United States, prompt in other matters to take part with the foremost and freest nations in asserting the principles of liberty and human rights, have lagged behind Europe on the subject of Negro emancipation. The chief reason is that a regard for law conflicted with a regard for liberty. To the American citizen, the Constitution stands in the place occupied, under the monarchical system, by the sovereign in person. It is the highest object of his loyalty. His veneration for that instrument went so far as to influence his perceptions of justice. A majority in the North have always held it to be a great wrong that human beings and their descendants forever should be held in bondage. Up to the time when this war made the slaveholders in 11 states our enemies, we acquiesced in that wrong, lest, in the endeavor to remedy it, greater evils might follow. Though it be true that, before the war, the legality of the slaveholders' claim to service or labor was denied, on humanitarian grounds, yet a construction of the Constitution, adverse to such denial and acquiesced in by the nation, throughout 2 generations, was held by most men to be sufficient reason why the claim in question should be regarded as private property and respected as such. The majority held to the opinion that it could not be taken except by a violation of the Constitution, in other words, by a revolutionary act. They felt that, though revolutionary acts become a justifiable remedy upon great occasions as in 1776, yet they are usually replete with peril, that it is easy to pass the limit of regulated authority, but impossible to estimate the dangers we may encounter when that guardian limit is once transgressed. That, in the minds of many Northern men, cupidity, excited sometimes by supposed commercial advantages, sometimes by selfish political calculations, came in aid of constitutional scruple, may not be denied. And so far as that motive prevailed, our complicity as a people is without palliation. But cupidity, commercial or political, was not the dominant motive, nor, but for the restraint of the Constitution, would sordid considerations have prevented the nation from shaking off the incubus which oppressed it. Slavery, therefore, moral wrong as it is, was tolerated by the majority as one of the articles in a great national compromise which it was unlawful and perilous to violate. If, before the South had trampled underfoot compromise and Constitution, those who directed the federal government, taking the initiative, had striven to eradicate the growing evil, the effort would have been vain, for they could not have carried the people with them. To human eyes there seemed, in this generation at least, no way out. But God, who overrules evil for good, opened the way. They, the chief architects of the great wrong of the age, in whose hands alone seemed to have been left the power to hasten its downfall, have madly persisted in the very course that is leading, swiftly and inevitably, to that result. In the early stage of the war, Congress and the President proposed, and the majority of the nation expected, as the issue of this contest, a mere rehabilitation, with Southern laws and Southern institutions re-acknowledged in their pristine form. In this, the President and the North were sincere. Again and again, warning was given, and the return of the insurgents to their loyal duty on these conditions was urged upon them. But their hearts were hardened, and they would not. By their obstinate perversity, they closed the door against themselves. They persevered in their conspiracy against public law until emancipation became an imperative measure of self-defense. They persevered until public opinion, revolutionized, demanded that measure as the only sure guarantee in the future for national safety and national peace. They, the slaveholders, became abolitionists of slavery. Let us not take credit to ourselves for generous philanthropy. The South, reckless and blind, was herself the unwitting agent. And thus, in the providence of God, the very effort by armed treason to perpetuate an abuse has given us at once the will and the right to effect its eradication. The time has come when it is constitutional to redress that abuse. No law restrains us. Henceforth, we are responsible if, in the race for human freedom, we lag with Spain behind the rest of the civilized world. Henceforth, we are responsible before God and man if, having at last become free to carry out in practice the noble declaration of our forefathers that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are among the inalienable rights of man, we basely refuse or neglect to do so, we have a greater responsibility still. We are as one having an oath upon his soul. The maxim is well known that he who legally acts by another is himself the actor. The legal acts of the president are the acts of the nation. It was the people of the United States who, on the 1st day of January, 1863, set free 3 millions of men. The deed is done, lawfully, righteously done. Its validity is as well established as that of any other public act. But to establish its validity is to establish the status as free man of every person that was held as a slave. In the insurrectionary districts named, on the 1st day of the year 1863, whether he shall have physically escaped from bondage or not, quote, all persons held as slaves, end quote, within these districts are the words. Is the deed valid? The words stand. Is it invalid? It cannot free a single slave. The argument, therefore, is unavailing that many of these people are still worked as slaves by persons setting at defiance the constitutional jurisdiction and the national will. A law set at defiance for the time is not thereby abrogated. In disturbed times, cases of illegal detention frequently occur. Such are these cases. But in the eyes of the law, the persons thus illegally detained have the rights of free men, and the radical bayonet must enforce these rights. Equally unavailing is the allegation that, as the proclamation was but a war measure, and therefore of force and virtue commensurate only with the war, its operation will cease when the immediate necessity which caused and justified it ceases, that is, when peace is restored. The exigency is as great in peace as in war. There are moral and national as well as physical necessities. America, said the great Earl of Chatham during a memorable debate in the House of Lords in 1770, quote, was settled upon ideas of liberty, end quote. In these ideas it was that our fathers founded the Republic. In these ideas alone can we, their descendants, maintain it. The political necessity that nevermore within these United States shall lifelong claims to service and labor beheld by inhabitants thereof, will be as great when peace returns as it is now while war rages. Always morally unjust, this property has shown itself to be nationally dangerous. But a species of property that endangers the safety of a nation must not be left in the hands of its citizens, whether in peace or war. Nor can it be pleaded that the taking of this property, vast as is its amount, is an act committed regardless of mercy to the vanquished, an act of harsh severity, much less a deed of plunder. No, nor yet a measure of punishment. Far from offending against any principle of humanity in destroying such property, in other words, in canceling lifelong claims to service and labor, the inhumanity would have been to refrain from destroying it. Nor do we harm the slave claimant, but greatly benefit him by canceling these claims. In point of fact, it is incalculably to his advantage, socially, pecuniarily, politically, to be without them. While he retains them, there will be between him and us a lack of the conditions necessary to a true union. There will be no loyal concurrent sentiment of citizenship, but a forced union of states without the conditions under which alone concurrence of ideas and affections is possible would be a measure unworthy of a statesman. Slaveholders and freemen can never, in these states, act together in friendship again. Therefore, for his own sake, the slaveholder must cease to be such. Are we impertinently interfering in his business, arrogantly and improperly assuming to judge what is best for him when we determine this? Not at all. The business is emphatically our own, for it intimately concerns our national existence. In deciding it as we see fit, there is neither impropriety nor arrogance, but proper precaution and prudent foresight. If he had refrained from levying war against his government, he would have had the right to judge and act in this affair. As it is, he has lost it, and we have now the right and the power to decide the matter, not he. But in the second place, our power is restricted to the abrogation of these claims, and it ceases there. As a trust for a special object is exhausted with the execution of that object, so is the authority of the President, being in the nature of a trust, in this case. His object was to restore and render stable the national unity. To effect that great object, to preserve from permanent dismemberment the country over which he presides, he enfranchised 3 millions of its inhabitants. Under this act of his, third parties took vested rights. Under the inducements of this act of his, third parties took refuge within our lines, enlisted in our armies, fought in our battles. We had a right to confer these vested rights. We had a right to present these inducements. We had a right to accept this aid. But having done all this, we have no right to resume what we have granted. We had a right to act. We have no authority to revoke our action. To enslave is not a power under the Constitution. No officer or department of the government can exercise it. From that stain, at least, we are free. Were it otherwise, our government would be the scorn of the age, a disgrace to Christendom. footnote that the Supreme Court of the United States has no right to sit in judgment upon or to reverse a great measure of national policy is as certain as that the powers of that court are judicial, not legislative. We do not argue this point at length here because it comes up more appropriately in the chapter treating of the constitutionality of emancipation in the loyal slave states. There the argument will be found at length, with references to the decisions of that court itself which bear upon this subject. End footnote. We have lost, by our own solemn act, the right henceforth to talk of Reconstruction with the peculiar institution of the South left intact. Such language is now but a mischievous mystification. If the South conquer, she may, by superior force, hold as slaves those who, by our laws, are free men. But for us, there is no longer, in any of the insurrectionary states, a peculiar institution to be left intact. We may build up anew that institution, in violation of law, it is true, for neither the President nor Congress nor any judicial tribunal in the land has any more authority to consign a freedman to slavery than they have to hang him without crime or trial. But we may build it up if we have power enough, or connive at it if we are shameless enough, just as a highwayman may seize a purse, or a burglar carry off a basket of silverware. Whether, when we shall have suffered vanquished treason to dictate her own terms, whether, when we shall have stooped to purchase, not peace, for God's best blessing cannot be so purchased, but a worthless truce, as brief as treacherous, by an act of usurpation that assumes to sign away the liberties of 3 millions of free people. Whether, when we shall have done this great thing, we shall have any right to set up for more honest or more virtuous than the felon trader, who makes a midnight descent on the Congo coast and steals thence 300 or 400 wretches to crowd the hold of his slave ship. That will be a question to be settled at our leisure with our own consciences. The way of the transgressor is hard. It is better to lose fortune than fair fame. And national disgrace is worse than national disaster. A convict, when he is known and remembered as such, may, because of the stain that attaches to him, toil faithfully through half a lifetime ere men take him again by the hand. And a people, stamped by their own public records as lawless and forsworn, may travel a long and a weary road, a reproach the while, and a byword among nations, ere they can take an honored stand once more among the civilized powers of the earth. In concluding this branch of the subject, I briefly group together the propositions that have been advanced. The inhabitants of the insurrectionary states are, in contemplation of law, without exception, public enemies. Property belonging to an enemy may, by the law of nations, be seized by the proper military authority and appropriated or destroyed. In like manner, claims or debts due by a public enemy to an inhabitant of this country may be seized and cancelled. The claims to service or labor upon which rests Negro slavery are, in contemplation of the Constitution, in the nature of debts or choses in action, and may, when held by an enemy, be declared null and void. These claims, because of the labor which they command, constitute a chief resource of the insurgents for carrying on the war, and therefore essentially tend to protract it, for which reason it was the duty of the commander-in-chief to take and cancel them. The interests growing out of these claims have been the cause of the present insurrection, and there can be no sufficient guarantee for peace while they exist, for which reason also it becomes a duty to declare them null and void. These claims involve a great moral wrong which the insurrection has made it legal to redress, and we are now responsible as a nation if we fail to redress it by their abrogation. The President's proclamation of emancipation was legal and righteous. It was the act of the nation, and cannot lawfully, nor without violating the national faith, solemnly pledged, be revoked. Therefore, the emancipation of all the slaves in the insurrectionary portions of the Union was an act legal and irrevocable. End of Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 2. Recording by Grace Buchanan.
Part 2, Chapter 4 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Madison Rutherford. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 2, Chapter 4. The Constitutionality of Emancipation in the Loyal Slave States. As the slaveholders of the insurrectionary states, now at war with the United States, are public enemies, while the slaveholders of the border or non-insurrectionary slave states are friends, entitled to all the rights of citizens, the question touching the right to confiscate and cancel the claims to service and labor held by the former is essentially a different question, based on different principles, from the question whether we have a constitutional right to take and cancel the same class of claims held by the latter. In the preceding pages, it has been shown that slavery was the cause of the present insurrection, that if slavery be suffered to continue in existence, it will remain a constant menace to the integrity of our government and an inevitable source of future war, and that, therefore, prudence and foresight require that, for the sake of the national unity and national peace, slavery be forever abolished throughout these United States. Though the military necessity be more urgent in the insurgent states, seeing that every slave taken or escaping from bondage is one laborer less to supply the enemy's commissariat, yet the general proposition is as true of the border states as of those in rebellion. Indeed, fugitive slave law difficulties, of all others the most likely to bring on a war, would chiefly arise through refugees from border states. The slaves of disloyal owners in these states have already been emancipated by act of Congress. There remain in bondage under state laws certainly less than 750,000, scattered over a long, narrow border strip, bounded on the north by free states and on the south by states whence slavery has been legally banished, or else dotted in isolated parishes or counties intermixed with enfranchised slaves. Can we maintain in perpetuity so anomalous a condition of things? Clearly not. At every step, embarrassments innumerable obstruct our progress. No industry, no human sagacity would suffice to determine the 10,000 conflicting questions that must arise out of such a chaos. Must the history of each Negro be followed back so as to determine his status, whether slave or free? If Negroes emancipated in insurrectionary states are sold as slaves into border states or into accepted parishes or counties, can we expect to trace the transaction? If slaves owned in the border states or in accepted parishes or counties are sold to loyal men in insurrectionary states, are they still slaves or do they become free? Are we to admit or to deny the constitutionality of border state laws which arrest and imprison as vagrants and sell into slavery to pay expenses of arrest and imprisonment free Negro emigrants from insurrectionary states? But why multiply instances? The longer this twilight of groping transition lasts, it will be only confusion, the worse confounded. To respect and to protect such a straggling remnant of slavery would be practically impossible if it were desirable, and, aside from its being an old root of bitterness left in the ground to sprout and bear fruit in the future as it has borne fruit in the past, no freedman can be assured of his liberty while there remains a spot within the Union where he can be held as a slave. If we would act as statesmen, having in view the peace and safety of our country through all future time, we must meet the great difficulty before us broadly, effectually, honestly, and in accordance with the dictates of Christianity and civilization. The demands of honor coincide with the conditions of safety. To satisfy both, we have a great duty to perform. It is to follow the noble example of England and France and Sweden and Denmark and Portugal and Russia and Holland. It is to enact not merely that all persons held as slaves who happened on the 1st of January 1863 to be within certain insurrectionary limits shall be free, thus leaving a narrow belt of slavery to divide our country in two, and to separate the freed states of the South from the free states of the North. It is not merely to carry out this fragmentary and imperfect scheme. It is not to do, for the cause of humanity, only what we cannot help doing. It is not merely to deprive the enemy in this present war of the means that augment his strength and enable him to protract the contest. It is, by taking a brave, bold stand for human liberty, irrespective of race or color, to lay deep and firm the foundations of that domestic tranquility which endures from generation to generation, only for those nations whose people walk in the paths of justice and mercy, approved in the sight of God and man. It is to enact, once and forever, the emancipation of every slave that treads the soil of the United States. In the progress of this insurrectionary upheaval, we have reached a point at which there is neither honorable nor prudent alternative left. Does any constitutional difficulty stand in the way? The law or custom of all civilized nations, based on considerations of public utility, authorizes the taking of private property with just compensation for public use when important public interests demand it. We are familiar with the operations of such a rule. When a conflagration in a city threatens to spread far, houses in the line of its progress may be seized and destroyed by the authorities in order to arrest it, and the owners are not held to have been wronged if they are paid for such losses under an equitable appraisement. The opening of a street and improving a city, the running of a railroad, are held in this and other countries to be objects of sufficient importance to justify what the French law calls appropriation forcée pour cause d'utilité publique. This principle is expressly recognized in the Constitution. In that instrument there is an admission of the right to take private property, with just compensation made, for public use. And it will not be argued that a claim of one inhabitant of the United States to the service of another, whether for a term of years or for life, is a species of property which has been constitutionally exempted from such appropriation. It is evident that, if a claim to the service of a slave cannot constitutionally be so taken and cancelled, neither can the claim to the service of an apprentice. Thus, the right to declare compensated emancipation in the United States is clear, provided important public interests demand it. But we have already shown that the public interests demanding such a measure, in this case, are the highest and the most vital that ever presented themselves to the councils of a nation. The right referred to is vested in the national legislature. If technical proof of this be demanded, it is to be found in a few brief propositions. 1. The Constitution, Section 8, confers on Congress certain essential powers as to collect taxes, without which no government can be supported. 2. The Constitution, same section, authorizes Congress to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution these powers. 3. An insurrection extending over 11 of the United States prevents, throughout a considerable portion of the Union, the possibility of carrying into execution the essential powers thus granted to Congress. 4. Because of the resistance offered by the insurrectionary states to these constitutional powers, it becomes the duty of Congress to pass all laws that are necessary and proper, not only by successfully terminating the war, to enforce these powers in the present, but to secure their supremacy in the future. In other words, to ensure permanent obedience to the laws, thus averting anarchy. All this will be conceded, but a question remains. Who is to judge what laws are necessary and proper to carry into execution the powers expressly conferred on Congress by the Constitution, and which are thus obstructed and defeated? Or, to put directly the case in point, if Congress, sharing the deep conviction that has come over the nation as this contest proceeded, should reach the conclusion that there is no effectual means to secure, throughout the future, peaceful obedience to the laws, except the eradication of slavery, and should act accordingly, is such action constitutional and final? In the selection of the means to effect this constitutional object, is Congress the sole judge of their propriety and necessity, or is the question as to the fitness of these means a judicial as well as a legislative question? We must discriminate here. It would undoubtedly be competent for the Supreme Court, if the question came legitimately before it, to decide, in any special case, whether Congress has the right, under the Constitution, to take private property with just compensation for public use. That is a judicial question. But when a vast system of claims is to be thus taken for a great political end, when this is done as the only effectual means to preserve the integrity of the Union, or to bring a war to a successful issue, or to establish lasting peace, and when the matter to be decided is whether this taking is the most wise or appropriate means to secure these all-important objects, that is a question of statesmanship, of governmental discretion, of political expediency, and therefore purely legislative. It is not competent for the Supreme Court to sit in judgment on the wisdom of a great measure of national policy. Whenever the judicial branch of the government assumes and is permitted to exercise such a power, the government itself will be in the hands, not of the representatives of the people elected by the people, but of a few men, at the present 10 only, nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and holding their offices for life. The trust which, by the Constitution, is committed to the personal judgment and discretion of the national legislature, and for which the members of that legislature are responsible only to their constituents, the people, will have been usurped by another branch of the government, to which the Constitution assigns no such trust, grants no such discretion. Nothing would be more radically subversive of our institutions than such an usurpation of jurisdiction. If it were consummated, we should be living under an oligarchy, not under a republic. But we need be under no apprehension that it ever will be. The Supreme Court itself, speaking by the mouth of one of its most distinguished presiding officers, has expressly disclaimed the possession of any such authority. In the well-known case of McCulloch against the state of Maryland, Chief Justice Marshall delivered the decision of the Supreme Court, and by that decision the following principles were established. 1. The construction of the words necessary and proper as employed by the framers of the Constitution in the above connection. The Chief Justice says, "The term necessary does not import an absolute physical necessity so strong that one thing to which another may be termed necessary cannot exist without that other." 2. As to the degree of the necessity which renders constitutional a law framed to carry a constitutional power into execution, the rule by the decision is, if a certain means to carry into effect any of the powers expressly given by the Constitution to the government of the Union be an appropriate measure, not prohibited by the Constitution, the degree of its necessity is a question of legislative discretion, not of judicial cognizance. 3. But still more explicitly is the question answered, who is to be the judge of the appropriateness and necessity of the means to be employed, thus: the government, which has a right to do an act and has imposed upon it the duty of performing that act, must, according to the dictates of reason, be allowed to select the means. Thus, then, the matter stands. The powers to lay and collect taxes, to exercise authority over forts and arsenals of the United States, to suppress insurrection, and various others equally essential, are expressly given by the Constitution to Congress. It is the right and duty of Congress to carry these powers into effect. In case of obstruction or defeat of existing laws framed to that intent, it is the right and duty of Congress to select such means and pass such additional laws as may be necessary and proper to overcome such obstruction and enforce obedience to such laws. These means must not be prohibited by the Constitution, but whether they are the most prudent or the most effectual means, or in what degree they are necessary, are matters over which the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction. As Chief Justice Marshall has elsewhere in this decision expressed it, for the Supreme Court to undertake to inquire into the degree of their necessity would be to pass a line which circumscribes the judicial department and to tread on legislative ground. There must, of course, be congruity or relevancy between the power to be enforced and the means proposed to enforce it. While Congress is to judge the degree of necessity or propriety of these means, they must not such as to be devoid of obvious connection with the object to be attained. In this case, the objects to be attained are the enforcement of the laws, the suppression of the rebellion, the restoration of preservation of peace, and the maintenance of the national unity. But these laws are resisted, and this insurrection prevails, and the national unity is violated in those states and in those states only in which the lifelong claims to the service or labors of persons of African descent are held under state laws. In states where these claims are comparatively few, as in Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, disaffection only prevails, while in states where the number of slaves approaches or exceeds that of whites, as in South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, insurrection against lawful authority is flagrant and outspoken, the insurrectionary acts of these states being avowedly based on the allegation that slavery is not safe under the present constitutionally elected president and that its permanent preservation can be ensured by the disruption of the national unity alone. All this is matter of history, and there would be as much propriety in denying the connection between the sun and the light of day as that between slavery and the rebellion. This point settled, nothing remains to be determined except the question whether, under existing circumstances, emancipation be or be not the policy most fitting and wise, the policy best calculated to assure, in the future, the peaceful execution of the law. And this, according to the dictates of reason, to repeat Chief Justice Marshall's words, must be left to Congress to decide. If Congress believes that emancipation is no longer a question of sectional interference, but of national preservation, it has the right to judge, and the constitutional right to act upon that judgment. If Congress believes that, in order to enforce law and suppress insurrection, it is necessary and proper to take and cancel all claims to lifelong service or labor held in the slave states, and if claims to service or labor, whether for years or for life, held by one inhabitant of the United States against another, be a species of property not specially exempted by the Constitution from seizure for public use, then an act of compensated emancipation is strictly constitutional. The substance of the argument here made amounts to this, that, as to the claims to service or labor by persons of African descent held by inhabitants of insurrectionary states or by disloyal inhabitants of other states, it is lawful to confiscate and cancel them without compensation, while as to such claims held by loyal men in non-insurrectionary states, it is legal to take them, making just compensation. In other words, in the former case uncompensated emancipation, and the latter compensated emancipation, is in accordance with law and permitted by the Constitution. That is the legal aspect. In a humanitarian view, emancipation is one of the highest duties of Christian civilization. End of Part 2, Chapter 4. Recording by Madison Rutherford.
Part 3, Chapter 1 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio. InterfaceAudio.com. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States, by Robert Dale Owen. Chapter 1, from Part 3. The Future of the African Race in the United States. Chapter 1. Forebodings regarding the future of the Negro. Among the problems connected with the future of our country, the destiny of the African race among us is one of the most important, and on no other great national question have more erroneous ideas prevailed, both among ourselves and among those who have looked on, even with favoring eyes, watching the progress of our Republican experiment. There are evils so vast and radical that nothing short of a bloody revolution has hitherto been found sufficient to extirpate them. So the eradication of slavery throughout a country containing 4 million of slaves, estimated by their masters as property worth 12 or 1,500 millions of dollars. So a difficulty greater still, the eradication of that prejudice of race and color which first suggested to the cupidity of white men the exaction of forced labor from Negroes, and has ever since been fed and fostered through the influence of the abuse to which it gave birth. Such a revolution may bring about changes of national opinion and national condition, which wise and philosophical writers had pronounced to be beyond the limits of possibility. Thus de Tocqueville, when in his work on American democracy he said, "To induce the whites to abandon the opinion they have conceived of the moral and intellectual inferiority of their former slaves, the Negroes must change. But as long as this opinion exists, they cannot change." This would make the future of the American Negro, free or slave, absolutely hopeless. But no absolutely hopeless future exists, under the economy of God, in this world of progress. There were never sufficient reasons for saying this, but to say it today would be far more inexcusable than to have said it when de Tocqueville wrote. We have gathered, during the vast upheavals of the last 3 years, such experience as ages of undisturbed monotony might fail to furnish. Events have occurred which no human foresight could anticipate. Contingencies have arisen which not only convulse our political world, but stir to their foundations the social elements of society around us. The whites have changed and are still rapidly changing their opinion of the Negro. And the Negro, in his new condition as a freedman, is himself, to some extent, a changed being. No one circumstance has tended much to these results as the display of manhood in Negro soldiers. Though there are higher qualities than strength and physical courage, yet in our present stage of civilization there are no qualities which command from the masses more respect. But de Tocqueville could never have imagined, even as a remote possibility, the raising and equipping in the United States of 100,000 Negro troops. His anticipations turned in a different direction. He did not look forward to an insurrection of the whites against the government. He predicted an insurrection of slaves against their masters. He predicted further that emancipation itself would not avert this catastrophe, but this last prediction was based upon the assumption that, free or slave, the whites would never accord to the blacks their rights as freemen. He says, "I am obliged to confess that I do not regard the abolition of slavery as a means of warding off the struggle of the two races in the Southern states. The Negroes may long remain slaves without complaining, but if they are once raised to the level of freemen, they will soon revolt at being deprived of almost all their civil rights." If de Tocqueville's premises were just, we might admit his conclusion. We cannot expect in a democratic republic to maintain domestic tranquility if we deprive millions of freemen of their rights as such. Public opinion may not, at the present time, have reached this conviction, but it is fast approaching it. 3/4 of the state might not today, but ere long they will, pass some such amendment to the Constitution as this: Slavery shall not be permitted, and no discrimination shall be made as to the civil or political rights of persons because of color. Whenever we shall have so amended the Constitution, the path before us will be plain and safe. But short of entire justice, there is no permanent security. End of Part 3, Chapter 1. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio, interfaceaudio.com. Part 3, Chapter 2 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio, interfaceaudio.com. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States, by Robert Dale Owen. Chapter 2. Do we need the aid of the Negro as a loyal citizen? In the immediate exigencies of our present situation is to be found strong additional motive for such an act. It would be, under any circumstances, a thing anomalous and repugnant to our system of government that 4.5 millions of the governed free citizens, like the rest, should remain permanently taxed and not represented. But aside from the essential injustice of this, its political results merit our gravest consideration. At the close of the war, after the waste in battle of human life, and the further diminution in the South of her white population by emigration to Europe and to Mexico, the inhabitants of the insurrectionary portion of the Union will, we may assume, be nearly equally divided between the races. How will these inhabitants stand divided as to loyalty? This is a question which it is impossible to answer with precision, except as to the colored people. They, with exceptions so rare that they are hardly worth taking into account, are all loyal, as our commission, coming into contact with them in every portion of the Union where they can be reached, abundantly verified. But in what state of mind will the close of the present contest leave the vanquished? Not only as to those who engaged from the first heartily in the war, but as to that larger number whose sympathies, after the strife commenced, gradually became enlisted in what they called the cause of the South, inducing them to join the rebel ranks without compulsion. Can we seriously doubt the present state of their feelings towards us? Will these be less bitter if we quell this rebellion? Submission is not conversion. The sword conquers, it does not convince. Time alone can allay the widespread irritation which so embittered and protracted a struggle as this must needs leave behind it. And meanwhile, to whom shall we be able to trust for re-establishment of order and maintenance of loyalty in the pacificated districts? To the Union men of the South who, with their lives in their hands, resisted, through good and through bad report, the torrent of secession which inundated their land. Who can doubt their zeal and their courage? But what is their number? Is it a half, or a third, or a fourth of the whole number of Southern whites? The inevitable, doubtless, has great power over all men. From a hopeless cause there are numerous deserters, but will not many of these be weak and unreliable? And when all are reckoned, will not 2/3, 3/4 remain, only sullenly acquiescent? All thoughtful men will give to such consideration much weight, and will acknowledge, with earnest anxiety, the difficulties that lie before us. They will admit it to be one of the great questions of the day, whether, leaving the abstract right or wrong of the case untouched, we can prudently or safely, for our own sakes, withhold from the freedman his political rights, and thus leave disenfranchised, at a critical juncture in our history, a loyal half of a disturbed and disaffected population. They will ask themselves whether, as we have found need of the Negro as a soldier to aid in quelling the rebellion, We do not require his assistance as pressingly, in the character of a loyal citizen, in reconstructing, on a permanently peaceful and orderly basis, the insurrectionary states. The doubt which naturally suggests itself in opposition is not whether loyal votes are urgently needed, but whether by admitting the freedmen to suffrage we may not seriously lower the average character of the constituency, which under our democratic system elects to office state representatives, congressmen, municipal authorities, a president, and other subordinate magistrates, whether by such a step we do not risk the failure or the degeneracy of our republican system. It will suggest itself that the Negro, while in slavery, was debarred from education, and that at this day few of the freedmen can either read or write. In addition to the ignorance resulting from this disability, we find vices among slaves just freed which appertain to their former condition. Men who own no property do not learn to respect the rights of property. Men who are subjected to despotic rule acquire the habit of shielding themselves from arbitrary punishment by lying. Men who have never worked for themselves learn to shirk work, which is to inure solely to the benefit of others. All this is to be taken into account. But with the extirpation of the cause, the effect gradually ceases. In point of fact, it has already been found, as our commission satisfactorily verified, that the vices above referred to are not deeply rooted, and that each may be gradually eradicated by a proper appeal to the self-respect of the newly made freedman, and by a strict recognition of his rights. He is found quite ready to copy whatever he believes are the obligations connected with the rights of what he looks up to as the superior race, even if these prove a restraint upon the habits of license belonging to his former condition. He is found willing also to work for moderate wages, if promptly paid, docile and easily managed, not given to quarreling, of temperate habits, cheerful and uncomplaining if treated with justice and common humanity. It should be remembered, too, in estimating his capacity to exercise political rights, that slavery had rendered him wary and suspicious. The habit of the slave is, while assenting to whatever his master says, secretly to hold his own opinion, and to act upon it whenever opportunity offers. His sagacity is developed. I do not think the freedman will be found a ready tool for the political demagogue. Upon the whole, we shall find it difficult to bring any argument against recognizing the political rights of the Negro, which does not apply against the principle of universal suffrage itself. Many regard the result of that principle as a practical failure, adducing in proof the fact that there are tens of thousands of voters among us incompetent and unworthy to act as such. Some have sought to obtain purity of elections by weeding out all foreign-born voters. But if suffrage is to be restricted by qualification, we must seek some stricter test of honesty and competence than the accident either of birth or of color. Under ordinary circumstances, it would seem not unreasonable that we should delay the recognition of the freedman's right to suffrage for a time, until education and habits of freedom had prepared him to exercise it. We might delay if domestic tranquillity prevailed, if the loyalty of those states chiefly inhabited by the Negro were unquestioned. We might delay if we could dispense with his aid. But I am able to make no reliable calculation according to which we can dispense with it. When we shall first proceed to Reconstruction, 1/3 of all the white population of the South is a full estimate for the proportion we are likely to find honestly and earnestly disposed to aid us in the work. That is 1/6 only of the entire population, white and colored. But can we safely proceed to organize a republican government in any country on the basis of 1/6 of its population? Should we evince common sense in attempting to do so, when we can have 3/6 more to aid that small band of Southern loyalists in their arduous task? God, who made the liberation of the Negro the condition under which we alone could succeed in this war, has now, in his providence, brought about a position of things under which it would seem that a full recognition of that Negro's rights as a citizen becomes indispensable to stability of government in peace. In view of such considerations, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that before receiving back into political fellowship the insurgent portions of the Union, it should be legally established as one of the principles imperative in Reconstruction that all freedmen should be legally secured in equal rights, thus practically carrying out the section of the Constitution which provides that the United States shall guarantee to every state a republican form of government. From the observations made in various sections of our country, which as a member of our commission it became my duty to visit, I do not believe that in accepting this necessary aid we incur risk of admitting into our system of government an element of deterioration. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio, interfaceaudio.com.